Chapter 244. The dense forest was still somewhat damp. Most likely the earliest storm last night had ravaged this part of the forest. Everywhere was wet. Behind him, the already dead Kunlun disciple was lying in the dirty water. The air began to fill with a strong smell of blood, but it did not come from a dead body. That dim light in the depths of the forest seemed to be slowly approaching. Because the sky was dark, the forest was too dark, and there were many trees blocking the view. So Lu Chen could not see clearly what it was. He could only vaguely see that it was a huge monster, but it did not look like a human, so most likely it was a demon beast. Lu Chen's heart sank. He suddenly thought that during this escape, especially after entering this part of the forest, he did not see a single demon beast. This was obviously not right. And from the sharp breath coming from the front, he was afraid that the demon beast that suddenly appeared was not a good one. Bloodthirsty and violent was unavoidable. Encountering this kind of thing, the best way was of course not to take it head-on. Not to mention that Lu Chen's current situation was not much different from a lamp that had run out of oil. He was just short of collapsing with one touch. To be honest, with his experience these few days, not to mention ordinary people, even if it was a normal cultivator, not many people would be able to withstand it. Lu Chen tried his best to calm his breathing, and then began to slowly retreat. In the process of retreating, he did not even dare to turn his back to the dim light in the dense forest, because his past experience had long made him know that if he still showed his back when encountering a powerful demon beast, it was equivalent to shouting to the demon beast to quickly come and eat him. It was just that in these few days, his luck seemed to be extremely bad. He had only retreated 3 or 4 steps when suddenly a gust of cold wind came from the forest behind him. Lu Chen's expression changed. He looked back and saw that in the forest, 2 figures slowly appeared. Both were dressed in black from head to toe. Their faces were covered with a black cloth. One was holding a long sword, the other was holding a strange weapon like a flying ring. Looking at their attire, coupled with their undisguised murderous aura, as well as the deep-seated hatred in their eyes, it was 100 times stronger than the Kunlun disciple. They were obviously from the Three Realms demonic sect. Lu Chen sighed. After hesitating for a moment, he still slowly turned around, facing the 2 demonic sect disciples, giving his back to the mysterious demon beast in the forest. Sometimes, humans were actually much more terrifying than demon beasts. Traitor! An angry roar filled with disdain and hatred came from the masked man in black. The 2 men did not have the slightest thought of tolerating Lu Chen's breathing or understanding that he was seriously injured and at the end of his rope. Without hesitation, they launched an attack. Their weapons flashed with a cold light as they fiercely slashed at Lu Chen. It looked like they wanted to immediately cut Lu Chen into pieces. The sword wielder charged straight into the middle of the door, while the person holding the strange flying ring weapon suddenly split into 2 in midair after activating his weapon. He split into 2 and circled around to both sides, actually forming a pincer attack with the other person. The killing situation was set in an instant. Without the slightest thought of tolerating Lu Chen's mercy, Lu Chen's breathing became heavier, his eyes cold. Suddenly the veins on his neck bulged. His entire body looked as if it was about to collapse in the wind. Without knowing where the strength came from, he suddenly shot forward, completely disregarding the 2 flying rings flashing with cold light behind him, directly pouncing towards the sword-wielding man in black. That man in black seemed to be taken aback, but he had no intention of retreating. Instead he gave a hideous laugh. The sword in his hand became even more intense, directly chopping over. Anyone could see that right now Lu Chen's entire body was covered in injuries. The situation was terrible. Right now it was just a deathbed struggle. Lu Chen's hurried leap caused him to temporarily pull some distance away from the flying rings behind him. However, the swift and fierce sword light in front of him abruptly closed in. In an instant, it was already right in front of him. Lu Chen's pupils even reflected the shadow of the sword light, but it suddenly disappeared right after, because all the light in his eyes was suddenly swallowed up by a ball of dark flames. The black flame ignited. Although it was already somewhat dim, the murderous aura did not weaken in the slightest. Darkness surged around Lu Chen, causing his figure to seem to blur for a moment in the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint. Pooh! A muffled sound, just as the sword light chopped in front of Lu Chen. The darkness still silently surged over the blade, flipped over the sword hilt, and wrapped around that black-clothed man's palm. Ah! The black-clothed man who had been brimming with killing intent suddenly howled loudly, as if he had suffered unimaginable pain in that instant. Even his voice was so sharp that it seemed to have deformed, causing the other black-clothed man not far away to jump in fright. The black flames burned on his hand, directly burning into the flesh. The long sword fell to the ground with a bang sound. An icy but familiar cold energy gathered from his wrist, once again merging into Lu Chen's dantian. As if bitten by the world's most terrifying venomous snake, that black-clothed man fell to the ground and began to struggle with all his might. But at this time the two flying rings were already chasing after him again. Lu Chen's body swayed, as if he wanted to dodge, but his body staggered, unexpectedly not dodging. Poo-pee-you sound, the two flying rings directly pierced into his back. Lu Chen's vision darkened, and he could no longer support himself. Staggering forward a few steps, his legs softened, and he knelt on the ground, using his hands to support himself, as if he wanted to force himself to stand up again. But no matter how hard he tried, he did not have the strength to support his body. Instead, he forced his body several times, causing several wounds to open up, and blood flowed out. But the blood was not too much. Not because the wounds were not deep enough, but because he had already lost too much blood. Finally, there was still no way out. Lu Chen only felt that his vision darkened. His entire body felt like it was about to fall apart, and the remaining traces of strength were quickly dissipating. And everything that he saw at this moment, the night, the forest, the trees, the shadows, the black-clothed, and that strange dim light, suddenly blurred and began to spin. All the sounds seemed to be fading away. The pain was like a tide from every corner of his body, making him feel like he was in the terrifying purgatory of the 9 netherworlds. This was a pain that was enough to make an ordinary person collapse in an instant, but Lu Chen felt a strange sense of familiarity. In the past 10 years, every time the black fire curse flared up, and the black flames burned his body, he would be immersed in this terrible pain, unable to extricate himself. Now, because he was about to die, was the black fire finally beginning to bite back? The black-clothed man with the flying rings glanced at his comrade who was obviously already twitching on the ground, and fiercely rushed up to kick Lu Chen. Lu Chen fell to the ground with a bang, dirty and wet soil splashing on his face. The black-clothed man cursed, his eyes revealing a fierce light, and with a wave of his hands, the two flying rings flew out of his body and back into his hands, bringing with it a flower of blood. At this moment, Lu Chen didn't even seem to have the strength to struggle, only moving his body slightly. The black-clothed man walked forward, and without saying a word, he swiped at Lu Chen's throat. It seemed that he didn't want to drag things out any longer, and wanted to kill directly for revenge. But at this moment, the forest suddenly darkened. The black-clothed man's hand subconsciously slowed, only to see a shadow suddenly surge from the front, flying into the air, filled with murderous intent, especially an unimaginably thick smell of blood. In the darkness, 2 dark green and cold lights swept past, like eerie but transparent gems, and also like the coldest ghost fire in the depths of the yellow springs, surging forward. The name of a huge monster blocked the black-clothed man's vision, leaving him with only darkness. The black-clothed man screamed. His heart was torn apart, but in front of such a terrifying beast, and a sudden sneak attack, he even lost the strength to fight back, and could only subconsciously reach out to cover his head. A fishy wind swept past, and the black-clothed man's body trembled, his whole body cold, but in the next moment he suddenly froze, only to find that he didn't seem to be injured. Looking up, he saw that the incomparably ferocious and terrifying monster that pounced from the darkness, that momentum like a mountain, actually pounced on empty air. In the dark mountain forest, a huge demonic beast appeared. It was shaped like a wolf, and its body was completely black. Its 2 huge eyes flickered with a cold and dark green light. It looked like a demonic wolf that had walked out from hell. But just now, that seemingly thunderous and murderous attack, this black wolf did not know why, after falling, it actually pounced a foot away from the black-clothed man, pouncing on empty air. The black wolf beast seemed to be a bit stunned. After a moment, it suddenly roared, looking a bit angry. Its 2 eyes shone with green light. It turned around and slapped the black-clothed man with its claws. Immediately, the black-clothed man's blood spurted out. Before he could react, the ferocious and terrifying beast had already pounced on him and knocked him to the ground. Then with a terrible roar and the sound of flesh tearing, the black-clothed man screamed a few times, and then there was no more sound. In the air of the forest, there was a bit of a bloody smell. Everything slowly quieted down. The black wolf stared at the dead man on the ground a few times, then turned around and walked to the side of Lu Chen. Its two eyes flashing with cold light, a terrible wolf mouth that was still dripping blood came over, as if it wanted to make a move on Lu Chen. Lu Chen's body moved a bit, then slowly turned over, still lying on the ground powerlessly. Facing the sky, he gasped for breath. The terrible wolf face appeared in his line of sight, especially the pair of snow-white sharp fangs that protruded out of the mouth, seemed to be colder and sharper than all the blades in this world. Lu Chen quietly looked at this black wolf, suddenly laughed. His laughter was not loud. When he laughed, it also seemed to be very painful, but in his laughter, there was a trace of warmth and gratification, mixed with a little pain. It was like in this dark and cold night, he finally came into contact with a trace of warm light. Lu Chen coughed, with a trace of pain, but he smiled at this fierce monster and said, "Hey stupid dog, I saw your stupid look just now." Ho! The black wolf monster roared, bared its teeth, and its hair stood up. It seemed to be instantly enraged, wanting to bite this man's throat in one bite. Chapter 245. Black Wolf stared fiercely at the man who looked like he was about to die. He bared his fangs, as if he was considering whether he should bite off this fellow's neck and silence him. Lu Chen was still smiling. He barely raised his right hand and patted Black Wolf's face. "Let's go. I don't know how many pursuers are behind us." Hei Lang growled in a low voice. He still looked a little dissatisfied, but his eyes quickly softened. The original coldness was gone, replaced by a hint of concern and anxiety. It lowered its huge head and extended it to Lu Chen's side, as if it wanted to push him up. However, Lu Chen struggled twice but was still unable to get up. Seeing that Lu Chen seemed to be at the end of his rope, Black Wolf panicked. He whimpered and used his head to gently nudge Lu Chen's body. Then he lay down beside him, probably urging him to climb onto his back. Lu Chen lay sprawled on the ground, panting heavily. His face was frighteningly pale. He looked like an exhausted dead dog. Black Wolf waited for a while. Seeing that Lu Chen was still motionless, he could not help but let out a low growl. After hesitating for a moment, Black Dragon suddenly stood up and bit towards Lu Chen. He bit the upper part of Lu Chen's arm and suddenly flung it. With a whoosh, a huge force came over. Lu Chen's entire body was involuntarily flung up. At the same time, several wounds on his body burst open again, causing Lu Chen to let out a muffled groan. The muscles on his face twisted, and in the next moment, his entire body was lying on Black Wolf's broad back. The soft but tough black fur carried a trace of warmth. In this cold night, there was a reassuring warmth. Black Wolf looked back at him, as if he was worried. Lu Chen panted for a moment. Even though there was blood at the corner of his mouth, he still laughed softly and said, "Well done. You can go now." The Black Wolf growled in a low voice before turning around and walking away. The forest in front of him was deep, and the shadows of the mountains were heavy in the distance. It had only taken 2 steps when Lu Chen, who was on its back, suddenly whispered, "Don't go back. Kunlun Mountain can no longer accommodate us." Hei Lang's footsteps came to a halt. Its eyes were filled with doubt, but it did not question Lu Chen's words. However, it still howled at the majestic mountain in the distance, as if it was pointing at something. Lu Chen suddenly became silent. He lay on Black Wolf's back, his head buried deep, his hands hanging weakly by Black Wolf's side. There was a hint of indifference in the air. Black Wolf seemed to be a little uneasy, and kept turning his head to look at Lu Chen. After a while, Lu Chen said in a low voice, "There's no need to look for Exian she. Dead." Roar. A terrifying howl suddenly burst forth from the Black Wolf's mouth. A dark green and cold flame instantly appeared in its huge eyes that had recovered. It was like a burning flame. It suddenly raised its head and stared at the deep night and the distant mountain in front of it. Killing intent was like a tide, emanating from the giant beast, as if it wanted to tear everything in front of it to shreds. It suddenly took a step forward, as if it was about to rush into the darkness in the distance. A hand covered in blood gently blocked its path. A moment later, Lu Chen's voice sounded in Black Wolf's ears. It seemed to carry a trace of calmness. "There's no need to go. I've already avenged her." Hei Lang's front foot paused in midair, and after a while, it slowly retracted it. It turned its huge wolf head and stared at Lu Chen with its terrifying green and murderous eyes. Lu Chen had no intention of avoiding it, and only nodded lightly at the giant wolf. The dark green flame slowly calmed down, and was replaced by an indescribable deep sorrow. The huge black wolf was silent. It stood where it was for a long time. It was as if many scenes from the past flashed past its eyes. In the valley of the land of chaos, there was a girl who was smiling like a flower. She hugged it and pouted her lips carefully. Her warm embrace, her kind smile, and her long-winded nagging. She was always smiling, she was always gentle, and she was always a little stupid. Even when they broke up, she would go the wrong way. But the night was so cold. The world was so cruel. And when the lives that should have died finally struggled to survive in her hands, the light fell on their hearts. Hei Lang carried Lu Chen on its back, slowly turned around, and walked in another direction, towards the south where its back was facing the tall mountain. The mountain forest was silent, and darkness and silence shrouded the surroundings. Lu Chen silently lay on its back, one man and one wolf, gradually walking away. But just as they were about to walk into the darkness, suddenly, that black wolf turned around, its huge eyes wide open, staring at the dark world, and let out an incomparably mournful howl. The howl spread far away, reverberating between the heaven and earth, reverberating in the night wind, and gradually fading away, as if it was a memory of the past. Then they finally walked into the darkness, disappearing into the distance. On the majestic Kunlun mountain, it was now deep in the night. On the heavenly Kuan peak, in the solemn and majestic Zhengyang Hall, Daoist Qian Deng finished his last task, and stood up from the spacious main seat. The chair was extremely spacious and looked very imposing. The wood used to make it was the extremely rare bloodwing sandalwood. It was a 4-vein top-grade spirit wood and was priceless. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that it was one of the most precious chairs in the world. Only a famous sect like the Kunlun Party, which had been passed down for 5,000 years and had never been severed, could possibly have such a profound heritage and such a treasure. As the highly respected Yuanying spiritual master of the Kunlun Party, Daoist Qian Deng naturally knew the origin of this bloodwing sandalwood throne, and also knew that in the long years of the past, only the spiritual masters of the Kunlun Party had the qualifications to sit on this chair. He had wanted to sit on this chair for a very, very long time. But today, when he really sat on it, he didn't feel particularly comfortable. The chair seemed a bit too hard. Although the bloodwing sandalwood was a top-grade spiritual wood, and could nourish spiritual power and calm the mind, this kind of spiritual wood naturally carried a different kind of strange smell. It wasn't a fishy smell, but a very strange smell. Some people liked it, and some people hated it. Daoist Qian Deng didn't like this smell, so he didn't like this chair either. But he liked the feeling of sitting on this chair very much. So when he stood up, he couldn't help but gently stroke the armrest next to him. He then revealed a satisfied smile, turned around, and walked into the rear hall of Zhengyang Hall. Although the night was dark, the side hall behind Zhengyang Hall was still brightly lit. But at this time, the many revered Yuanying spiritual masters that gathered in the hall had all disappeared. When Daoist Qian Deng walked into the hall, he only saw 2 people. One was the bald fatty true Lord Tianlan, who was sitting in the seat of honor, and the other was Zhuo Xian, who was standing respectfully to his side. Daoist Qian Deng glanced at Zhuo Xian indifferently with a hint of disdain in his eyes, but it quickly disappeared and was replaced with a respectful and warm expression. He walked up to True Lord Tianlan and bowed, saying, "Uncle Master, I've come." True Lord Tianlan opened his eyes and looked at Daoist Qian Deng. He smiled and said, "Qian Deng, you've come. Sit down and talk." "Yes." Daoist Qian Deng thanked him, and immediately sat down on the left side of True Lord Tianlan. This chair gave him a very familiar and comfortable feeling, especially when compared to the bloodwing sandalwood throne from before. This chair had been placed in this hall for many years, and he had also sat on it for many years. It had always been a position above everyone else and below only one person. For some reason, when he sat here tonight, there was a strange feeling in his heart. It was as if he felt that something was different from before. This subtle emotion flashed through Taoist Master Qiandeng's mind, but he didn't show it on his face. At the same time, Taoist Master Tianlan's voice sounded in his ears. Have you finished dealing with the matters outside? Taoist Qiandeng bowed slightly and nodded. Yes, the sect is now stable. Many disciples are in their positions, and there is nothing out of the ordinary. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded. Qiandeng, you've contributed greatly to the stable situation after the great change. Taoist Qiandeng smiled. It's all thanks to you, Uncle Master, that our Kunlun sect is able to remain calm in the face of danger. True Lord Tianlan pondered for a moment and then asked, How is idle month? Taoist Qiandeng paused for a moment, and subconsciously glanced at Zhuoxian, who was standing on the opposite side. At this moment, Zhuoxian happened to look at him as well, as if this question had touched him. Their gazes met in the air for a moment, and then moved away. Taoist Qiandeng respectfully said to True Lord Tianlan, Senior brother sect master is seriously injured and can't handle matters. For the sake of his cultivation and longevity, he had no choice but to go into seclusion in his cave abode. I'm afraid he won't be able to come out for the next 10 years. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded before sighing all of a sudden. Junior niece Xianyu is my senior brother's favorite disciple, and he had high hopes for her. It's a pity that she didn't want to meet with such a calamity. Taoist Qiandeng and Zhuoxian both looked down at the ground and didn't reply. After a moment, True Lord Tianlan said to Taoist Qiandeng, You've been busy for the whole day. Go and rest. I'm afraid you'll be busy for the next few days. Thank you for your hard work. Taoist Qiandeng hurriedly stood up and said, Uncle Master, you flatter me. This is what I should do. In fact, I'm not very capable. Ever since I was appointed as the acting sect master, I've always been afraid that I won't be able to do my job well, and let down the ancestors and Uncle Master's trust. In fact, if Uncle Master is free, on behalf of the 100,000 disciples in the sect, Qiandeng earnestly asks Uncle Master Qiandeng to take this position. Our Kunlun sect will be able to rise again, and regain the glory of our ancestors. Zhuoxian frowned slightly and glanced at Taoist Qiandeng. True Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment, and then revealed a faint smile. He looked at Taoist Qiandeng and said, Are you serious? Taoist Qiandeng's heart suddenly skipped a beat, and a chill appeared in his body. Chapter 246. There was a moment of silence in the hall. Taoist Master Qiandeng couldn't help but sneak a glance at True Lord Tianlan. He saw that the tall and sturdy man on the main seat had a gentle smile on his face. He looked benevolent and kind as he stared at him. After a moment, Taoist Master Qiandeng respectfully said, I am not lying. True Lord Tianlan suddenly laughed and pointed at Taoist Master Qiandeng. He then turned to Zhuoxian and said, Look, Qiandeng is such a humble person. He really doesn't care about fame and fortune. Zhuoxian smiled and nodded. That is true. I have always admired senior brother Qiandeng's noble character. Taoist Master Qiandeng smiled and nodded at Zhuoxian. His eyes also softened. At this time, True Lord Tianlan said, There are many complicated matters in the sect. I also have a lot of things to do in the Immortal Alliance, so it is better that you take this seat. Taoist Master Qiandeng's heart relaxed, but his face still showed some fear and trepidation. He spoke for a while more before taking his leave. Watching Taoist Master Qiandeng's departing figure, the smile on True Lord Tianlan's face gradually faded. When the figure of the current acting sect master of the Kunlun party disappeared from his sight, True Lord Tianlan's face was already indifferent and calm. It was quiet in the side hall. Zhuoxian stood silently at the side, his eyes looking at his nose looking at his heart. After an unknown amount of time, no one spoke in the hall. Zhuoxian's body didn't move at all, but a faint trace of cold sweat seeped out of his forehead. Just when the sudden cold atmosphere was about to suffocate everyone, Perfected Lord Tianlan, who was sitting on the main seat, broke the silence and said, Xianyue is your senior brother. Aren't you going to see him? When Zhuoxian heard this person's voice, he let out a breath with great difficulty. However, after hearing these words, his relaxed heart instantly tightened again. He didn't dare to have the slightest hesitation and said, "I didn't go to see him. Senior brother Xian, you didn't see the big picture, and didn't judge people well. There have long been complaints in the sect. Now that he's in seclusion to recuperate, Martial Uncle is showing him mercy. I thank Martial Uncle on behalf of Senior Idol Month." Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression was indifferent, as though he didn't react to Zhuoxian's flattery. Instead, after pondering for a moment, he suddenly thought of something and said to Zhuoxian, "I remember that Senior Brother Bai Chen just took in a new final disciple a few days ago. She's a girl in her early teens and is extremely talented. Her name is White Lotus. Where is she now?" Zhuoxian's heart skipped a beat. He hurriedly bowed and replied, "Reporting to Martial Uncle, Junior sister is young and playful. On the night of the full moon, she went down the winter peak by herself. I haven't seen her since then." Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned slightly before saying to Zhuoxian, "Senior brother Bai Chen has just passed away. How can his disciples not observe mourning in front of his coffin? Go find her and bring her back. Don't let senior brother's disciple wander outside the Kunlun party." Zhuoxian took a deep breath and felt his body turn slightly cold. However, he still replied respectfully, "Yes, I understand. I'll definitely bring her back." Perfected Lord Tianlan turned his gaze and stared at Zhuoxian for a moment before nodding. His expression eased up a little, as though he was about to say something. However, at that moment, there was a series of footsteps outside the side hall, followed by a clear voice. "Disciple He seeks an audience with Perfected Lord." Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced outside the door before nodding at Zhuoxian. Zhuoxian bowed and retreated. After walking to the door, he saw He standing a few feet away from the door, waiting patiently. Zhuoxian revealed a smile and nodded at He. He returned the smile and said, "Greetings, Uncle Master Zhua." Zhuoxian said, "Go in. Uncle Master Tianlan is inside." After saying that, the two of them brushed past each other. He took a deep breath, then strode forward and walked in with steady steps. "Disciple He greets Perfected Lord." He's voice seemed to be particularly steady and powerful, echoing in this secluded hall. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him with a faint smile on his face. "You're here. Sit down and talk." "Thank you, Perfected Lord." He sat down next to him with a respectful expression. Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "You did very well this time. I'm very satisfied." He hurriedly stood up to express his gratitude. However, his expression still seemed a little unnatural at this time, probably because he thought of what he had done. Tianlan waved his hand to indicate that he didn't need to be so polite. After a moment of silence, he took a step forward and said, "Perfected Lord, disciple came here today to report something to you. I've just come back from Kunwa City. Since last night, when we found many demons from the devil cult, our Kunlun disciples had a fierce battle with them. Now, it can be said that we have a complete victory. But," speaking up to this point, he suddenly paused as if he was a little hesitant. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him and said, "But what?" He hesitated for a moment and said, "But I heard that yesterday in Kunwa City, a demon from the devil cult with a strange black fire attacked the Su family and killed many people, including the beloved son of the Su family's master, Sumo. He also injured junior martial sister Su Qingjun." Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression was still indifferent. It was impossible to tell whether he was happy or angry. He just said calmly, "It seems that this demon isn't weak." He said, "That's right." After an investigation, it was found that he was a spy who sneaked into our Kunlun sect. He was a part-time disciple called Lu Chen. Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes flashed and he said, "This person is so cunning." He nodded and said, "That's right. We chased after this person, but he is sinister and cunning. We don't know how he escaped from Kunwa City, but he also injured several of our disciples along the way. Now, according to the last news we received, he has probably escaped to the south." "The south?" Perfected Lord Tianlan murmured. A moment later, he said, "Could it be that he escaped to the disorienting land?" He said, "That should be it." The disorienting land is the most chaotic place in the world. It's dangerous and unpredictable. Throughout history, there have been countless desperados and ferocious villains who have fled there when they have nowhere else to go. At the same time, there are also many remnants of the devil cult there. Presumably, that thief also went there. Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment and said, I heard that there were many demons from the devil cult inside and outside Kunwa City last night. Why did you only pay attention to this person? He said with emotion, Perfected Lord, this person has been lurking in our Kunlun sect for a long time, and has done countless evil deeds in secret. Now he has even killed and injured our disciples, which can be said to be a heinous crime. Disciple is untalented, but I'm willing to personally go to the disorienting land to kill this person, and take his life to comfort the souls of our fellow disciples who have sacrificed themselves. A sharp light flashed across Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes. The light at that moment seemed especially dazzling and almost as sharp as a knife. However, he just finished speaking and was lowering his head, so he didn't see this fleeting scene. Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't speak right away. Instead, he pondered for a moment and said with a calm expression, I didn't expect you to be so courageous. It's rare in the sect. But I have a feeling that you probably have something to say to me, right? Suddenly, he bent his knees and knelt down in front of Perfected Lord Tianlan. He kowtowed and said in a deep voice, Perfected Lord, please forgive me. I, have an audacious and presumptuous request. Please allow me to state it, Perfected Lord. Perfected Lord Tianlan said indifferently, Speak. He didn't raise his head and was still kneeling on the ground. With his head touching the cold ground, he said, Disciple is speaking nonsense. I sincerely hope that Perfected Lord will be merciful and accept he as your disciple. Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes narrowed slightly. After a while, he slowly stood up with his hands behind his back. He didn't reprimand he who was kneeling on the ground and didn't dare to raise his head, nor did he ask him to get up in a pleasant manner. He merely paced back and forth on the spot in silence. He's body didn't move at all. At this moment, no one knew what he was thinking. However, looking at how he was kneeling on the ground and prostrating himself, it seemed like he was ready to risk everything. Perfected Lord Tianlan took another 2 steps and said indifferently, You want me to accept you as my disciple? He said in a deep voice, That's right. Disciple knows that Perfected Lord has yet to accept a disciple, and that he doesn't have a teacher now. Disciple has admired and worshipped Perfected Lord for many years, and has always hated that I can't serve Perfected Lord. Today, there might be a chance, so Disciple wants to come and plead with Perfected Lord no matter what. Perfected Lord Tianlan raised his eyes slightly, but shifted his gaze from he to the door of the hall. The darkness of the night was boundless, as if the whole world was dark and shadows were everywhere. He seemed to be in a trance. After a while he said, I am Perfected Lord, not everyone can be my disciple. He kowtowed a few times and said, Yes, disciples' talent and comprehension are considered to be above average in our sect. If Perfected Lord accepts me, I will definitely train hard day and night without slacking off or tarnish your reputation. Other than that, Disciple is going to the chaotic land to hunt down the evil cult spies because I want to show what I have learned to you. Although I don't dare to boast that I am invincible in the world, I will definitely not disappoint you. A glimmer flashed across Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes. He then turned around and walked back to his seat. At the moment he turned around, there seemed to be a subtle self-deprecating smile on his face, but it disappeared in a blink of an eye. He said, So you are going to the chaotic land because of this? He did not answer but kowtowed and said, Please accept me, Perfected Lord. Disciple is infatuated and incomparably firm. If there is a chance in the future, Disciple is even more willing to inherit the Tian character Taoist title, and inherit Perfected Lord's legacy. Perfected Lord Tianlan's footsteps suddenly stopped. He stood still for a moment, and his voice suddenly became much deeper. He said, You still want my Tian character Taoist title? He gritted his teeth and said, Please grant me my wish, Perfected Lord. Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a long time with an indifferent expression, as if no one could tell what he was thinking. After a long time, He suddenly waved his sleeves and walked out. When he passed by He, who was still kneeling on the ground, he said indifferently, "We will talk about this after you go to the chaotic land and kill that person." Chapter 247. There was no one left in the quiet forest. There was only the mess left after the intense battle, and 3 lifeless corpses lying in the forest. Among the 3 corpses, 2 of them were the devil cult's disciples who were dressed entirely in black, while the last one was the Kunlun sect's disciple who was the first to rush over here to kill Lu Qin. However, the 3 of them had collapsed at a place that was about the same distance away, yet they were emitting a similar stench of blood. A gust of wind blew through the forest, bringing with it a faint aura. After a while, there was a sudden whistling sound coming from afar. Not long after, it arrived nearby. After a gust of wind swept past, several figures appeared. They were all people dressed in black. The 3 corpses on the ground entered their line of sight immediately. Someone immediately let out a cry of shock. Then a few people quickly went forward to check. The remaining people had cautious looks in their eyes. They held their weapons and guarded their surroundings, carefully looking into the dark depths of the forest around them. In the end, these black-clothed men were certain that the people on the ground were already dead. There was no way to save them anymore. Each of them stood up with an unpleasant expression. It seemed that one of them, who was hot-tempered, even used his leg to kick the dead Kunlun disciple as he cursed. A strange wind blew past. 2 figures descended from the sky and landed on the ground. They were Fan Tue and Chen He. When the surrounding black-robed men saw them, they all bowed and paid their respects. Fan Tue nodded his head slightly. Then he walked to the side of the 3 corpses with Chen He and squatted down to examine them. A strange expression appeared on his face. He wanted to say something but stopped himself. Instead, he extended his hand and waved at the surrounding black-robed men. The rest of the black-robed men quickly walked away without a word, leaving only Fan Tue and Chen He at their original spot. Only then did Fan Tue look at Chen He. He had a look of surprise on his face. He said to Chen He, "What kind of magical technique did this guy use? Why is it so strange?" Chen He also had a serious expression. His gaze swept past the wounds on the corpses in front of him. He said softly, "I have never seen this before either." Fan Tue thought for a moment and said, "You said that this person is very likely to be the traitor from the Battle of the Desolate Valley 10 years ago. It is said that that person was the proud disciple of Elder Yun Shouyang before he rebelled. Could it be that this is also a mysterious technique that is secretly passed down in our holy church?" Chen He shook his head and said, "It doesn't seem like it. At least, I've never seen or heard of the Holy Church having such a strange black flame devil skill." However, these traces seem to be similar to the witchcraft of some southern barbarians in the land of chaos. Fan Tue furrowed his brows and said, "Does this mean that we have misjudged him?" Chen He clapped his hands and stood up. A cold smile appeared on his face as he said, "There should be no mistake. No matter what, it is a joyous occasion to be able to discover this traitor. It is also a blessing from the ancestors of the Holy Church. As long as we can kill this traitor, we will be able to comfort the countless brothers of our sect who have died tragically over the past 10 years. If we don't kill him, if we don't tear this person into 1,000 pieces, it will truly be difficult to vent the hatred in my heart." Fan Tue nodded his head and said, "That is indeed the case. Then let's continue the chase. That traitor should already be injured. He won't be able to escape quickly." Chen He agreed and walked forward with Fan Tue. Not long after, they walked into the darkness. The group of black-clothed people behind them also quickly followed. Occasionally, someone would sigh regretfully and look back. No one cared about the 3 people who had died on the ground. Perhaps in the future, they would silently rot in the forest like this, turning into dust and returning to this vast forest, becoming a part of the earth between the heavens and the earth. However, not long after they left, a petite white figure suddenly appeared in this dark forest. An extremely beautiful young lady appeared from the darkness. She first looked in the direction that the devil sect members had left in. After confirming that there was indeed no one lying in ambush there, she lowered her head and began to observe the 3 corpses. However, what was strange was that she was not concerned about the Kunlun disciple, Nor was she concerned about the person who was wielding the longsword that Chin-hee and Fan Tue had been examining. Instead, after calmly looking at the two people beside her, this young lady's entire attention was on the devil sect disciple who was originally wielding the flying hoop. There were no traces of the black flame curse on this person's corpse. Instead, there were a number of large, bone-deep wounds that cut across his body, causing one's hair to stand on end. It was as if a terrifying beast had pounced on him and wreaked havoc, leaving behind a bloody wound that was too horrible to look at. This beautiful young lady did not look old, but she did not show the slightest hint of fear in the face of such a terrifying wound. Instead, she observed the person's chest with unusual calmness. After taking a closer look, the young lady's expression suddenly turned serious. She stood up and let out a cold grunt. Then she muttered to herself, "That black dog has indeed advanced to become a holy beast. I knew that my guess was right." As she spoke, her eyes darted around, as if she was thinking about something. She was a little hesitant. After a moment, she turned her head to look at the Kunlun mountain in the distance. Then she turned her head to look at the even further south. After comparing the two, she suddenly twisted her lips and walked toward the south. It was almost exactly the same direction that Lu Chen had fled in a few hours ago when he was still here. The huge black wolf galloped through the cold and dark night. Its speed was extremely fast, almost like the wind. However, the thick and broad back of this black wolf was unusually stable. Coupled with the soft wolf fur and the warmth that came from under its skin, it made Lu Chen feel as if he had arrived at the most beautiful place in the world. Even though the night was still endless, Lu Chen himself did not know where he was going. However, if he were to head south, he had a rough idea of where he would be heading. It would be nothing more than entering the disorienting lands. There were many people who went to the disorienting lands. Apart from the countless low-level rogue cultivators, there were also many disciples of various sects who had a strong background and divine powers. The disorienting lands was also the hometown of the black dog. The huge black wolf that was carrying Lu Chen on its back was, of course, the black dog. It originally had a powerful bloodline. After Lu Chen had cast a strange spell in the mysterious tree hole, Atsu suddenly erupted with all kinds of signs of power. At the last moment, after the strange full moon, it obtained the power of the full moon and broke through the records of the holy beasts in the southern barbarian tribes. In the process of advancing, Atsu obtained great power. At the same time, its powerful bloodline also displayed great primitive power under the rare moonlight. Almost all of the wounds on Atsu's body had healed. However, the most surprising thing was that the black dog could see again in one of its eyes that had been damaged. It could see again. Atsu's power had skyrocketed by 10 times. Even its body had become unusually large, filled with a strong sense of power. Lu Chen had never seen a so-called holy beast before. He only knew a little about the advancement of holy beasts. However, when this huge black wolf appeared in front of him, Lu Chen could almost recognize it at first glance. It was Atsu. Atsu also recognized him. When it saw that Lu Chen's body was covered with wounds and he looked like a lamp that was about to run out of oil, Atsu looked very anxious. However, in the end, it still brought Lu Chen away from this place. As he ran south, the wind howled. Lu Chen watched the darkness around him recede into the distance. He felt like he was swimming to the shore in the sea. However, he knew that it was just an illusion. The Kunlun party and the devil cult, these two great forces, were not willing to let him go. There was no longer a place for him in this world. Perhaps only the chaotic and dangerous disorientated lands would be his final home. Lu Chen suddenly thought of the things he had done in the disorientated lands 10 years ago. The corners of his mouth curled into a bitter smile. He did not expect that after more than 10 years, he would once again go to that disgusting place. The black wolf's bulging muscles were like a horned dragon. Every muscle showed the unbelievable power in this black wolf's body. However, this did not stop more people who wanted his life. The assassins arrived very quickly, including some disciples from the famous sections. After Lu Chen managed to deal with a group of people, he could only order Atsu to run into the forest instead of using the wide official road. This move was indeed effective. After entering the forest, the few Kunlun disciples behind them did not catch up. Instead, the devil cult assassins came one after another. However, the current Atsu was no longer the same as before. After absorbing the full moon essence, its power had increased greatly. It was possible that it was now a very powerful mutt in the vast land of the divine boat. This so-called powerful was because when they hid in the forest, Atsu would secretly lurk in the darkness for a while. Then, after a while, when it came back, Lu Chen saw something at the edge of Atsu's mouth. It even carried a faint smell of blood. That was a certain part of the body of the assassins who were chasing after them. On about the 7th day, Lu Chen and Atsu, who had been trekking over mountains and rivers, suddenly saw a familiar scene in their memories. It was the Dragon and Tiger Mountains side by side. Between the two mountains, there was a long and narrow passage that extended deep inside. Far away, in the distance, was the world's most dangerous place, the disorientated lands, which made all the cultivators in the world change their expressions at the mention of it. Lu Chen's body was originally like a lamp that had run out of oil. But after these 7 days of fleeing, the toughness of his body was once again displayed. He actually started to slowly recover his vitality. But when they started to walk towards the Dragon and Tiger Mountains, preparing to enter the passage and enter the disorientated lands, Lu Chen, who was still sitting on Hei Lang Atsu, suddenly sat up straight, and then used his hand to lightly pat Atsu's head. Atsu immediately obediently stopped. Lu Chen looked ahead. His expression suddenly became somewhat ugly. He saw that in front of him, on the passage between the valleys, there was actually a lady standing there. Her appearance was charming and beautiful. Her figure was exquisite and graceful. The front of her clothes seemed to be unbuttoned, faintly revealing some snow-white fullness. It actually had a kind of charm that could hook one's soul. But what was even more strange was, on that lady's face, there was a grave and stern expression. Even in that bright gaze, there was a bit of cold murderous intent. Just like that, she looked towards Lu Chen. Chapter 248. After fleeing for so many days, Lu Chen's injuries still hadn't fully healed. However, compared to when he had just escaped from Kunwa City, he was already much better. At the very least, he could now walk with some difficulty. However, ever since the Black Wolf Atsu advanced on the night of the full moon, it seemed as if it had changed completely. From day to night, it seemed as if it had endless energy and didn't feel anything while carrying Lu Chen on its back. Thus, Lu Chen simply used it as a mount all the way to the south. However, aside from the fact that Atsu sometimes ran too fast and was a bit bumpy, having such a mighty and domineering big black wolf as a mount was indeed very impressive and convenient. In fact, the reason why Lu Chen's injuries were able to recover so quickly was largely due to the fact that Atsu carried him all the way. Not only did it avoid most of the pursuers, it also saved him a lot of energy. However, now that they were in front of the Dragon and Tiger Mountains, they could enter the land of confusion through the canyon. Although it wasn't like they could fly freely in the sky and swim freely in the vast sea, it was still safer in the chaotic and dangerous land of confusion. However, at this moment, the woman who appeared in the narrow and long path in the canyon looked rather frail. She stood in the middle of the path and blocked the only path between the two mountains. Lu Chen jumped down from Atsu's back and slowly walked to the entrance of the canyon with Atsu following behind him. At this moment, the black wolf's body was abnormally huge. Just standing there, it seemed as if it wasn't much shorter than Lu Chen. With a pair of large wolf eyes and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth, it was extremely imposing. It could be said that it was ferocious as it glared fiercely at the woman in front of it. Lu Chen raised his head to look around and frowned slightly. He had lived in Crescent City for a period of time, so he wasn't unfamiliar with the area around Dragon and Tiger Mountains. If he remembered correctly, this small path in the valley was usually not so quiet. Even though there weren't many people here, it was common to see people coming and going. However, at this moment, apart from him and the woman who blocked the way, there was no one else in front of and behind the Dragon and Tiger Mountains. At this moment, the tall mountains were covered with green trees and vines. Occasionally, the cries of apes and birds could be heard. This was the only sound in this place. Everything was cold and cheerless to the point it was slightly unusual. Lu Chen's gaze once again descended onto the woman. He was just about to speak when his gaze suddenly focused because he saw a red-colored jade embedded on the woman's chest where the collar that stuck closely to her fair skin. It was shaped like an aureole, and its color was bright red and gorgeous. It looked lifelike, and it actually seemed as if it would flap its wings and soar into the sky. Lu Chen took a deep breath. His expression suddenly became serious. Looking at this woman, his voice also became deeper. Shuang? Shuang was a woman's nickname. Her real name was Shuang. She was the current leader of Fuyunji in Zhengxianmeng. In Zhengxianmeng, where cultivators were as numerous as the rain and experts were as numerous as the clouds, those who could hold the position of a division and a hall's leader were not simple people, not to mention Fuyunji, this kind of frontline hall that had been fighting tit for tat with the evil faction all year round, attacking each other and killing each other. Shuang became the leader of Fuyunji 10 years ago. Her identity and origin had always been mysterious. Her master's skills, supernatural powers, magical weapons and so on were all mysteries. Outsiders only knew that this woman had a seductive and beautiful appearance, but her way of doing things was very experienced. She was strict with her subordinates and even more ruthless to her enemies. Over the years, the number of evil faction disciples that died in Fuyunji's hands was uncountable. Furthermore, it was said that within the evil faction, there was an assassination list that recorded the enemies of the evil faction that they had a blood feud with. They were the enemies that the evil faction would kill at all costs, and Shuang was ranked third on this assassination list. Other than that, Shuang herself was also a rather legendary woman in Zhengxianmeng. Because of her high cultivation and natural beauty, coupled with her high position, she attracted the attention of countless people. Of course, there were also those who coveted her. But over the years, Shuang had always kept people at a distance, treating almost everyone with the same indifference. Of course, this was a very offensive way of doing things. Of course, if someone really coveted her beauty, no matter how much she feigned civility, as long as she didn't go to bed with him, she would still offend him. This was a very common thing in the cultivation world where male cultivators were the majority. But compared to other female cultivators, although Shuang had always been a maverick, she did not suffer any setbacks because of this. The biggest reason for this was that she actually had a huge and powerful backer behind her, and that was Supreme Lord Tianlan. Fuyunji was a sect that Supreme Lord Tianlan had single-handedly established, and he had never allowed any outsiders to interfere. Over the years, Shuang had even become the #1 general under Supreme Lord Tianlan's command in Zhengxianmeng. No one dared to provoke her because they were afraid of hurting her. Lu Chen had never seen this legendary woman in Zhengxianmeng, but he had once lived in seclusion for 10 years with the help of Fuyunji, so of course he had heard some things about Fuyunji. He had also heard some stories about Shuang, especially about her appearance, which had been described countless times in the legends. And when he called out the 2 words Shuang, the woman's gaze also fell on his face. Her eyes were very bright, and just like the legends said, because they were too bright, they seemed a bit fierce, as if they could see through a person's flesh and go straight to their heart with a single glance. And after looking at Lu Chen for a moment, the woman also opened her mouth and said, "Lu Chen?" Lu Chen was slightly surprised and said, "You know me?" Shuang stared at him and said, "You are the greatest shadow of my Fuyunji in the past 10 years. How could I not know you?" Lu Chen's expression changed slightly, then he took a deep breath and looked at Shuang. For a while the two did not speak, faintly facing each other on this valley path. After a while Lu Chen said, "Please make way, I want to go over." Shuang had no intention of making way. She calmly looked at Lu Chen and suddenly said, "Do you know that the fate of a shadow is to never see the light in this life?" Lu Chen didn't say anything. Shuang continued, "What you did in Kunwa City was the same as bringing about your own destruction. Do you know that?" Lu Chen glanced at her, but he still remained silent. Shui Ying's expression was calm, no emotions could be seen on her face. It seemed that from the beginning to the end, she was just calmly narrating some things. She said, "I don't care if you don't want to live, but you hid in Fuyunji for 10 years. Have you ever thought about what will happen to the people who have taken care of you all these years? The devil cult will definitely pursue you relentlessly. If they catch you, my subordinates will probably be dragged into this mess. Shuang looked at Lu Chun and said, if that's the case, I feel that since you're already in a hopeless situation, you might as well die earlier. What do you think? Lu Chun suddenly smiled and said, you want me to die? Shuang said, I think it's better for you to die than to live. At least you won't be a burden to others. Her eyes suddenly became a bit colder, looking as cold as a frosty blade. She said, in any case, you've already caused the deaths of many people, right? Lu Chen's expression instantly became cold. It seemed that these words still stung him. This woman, Shuang, was indeed as sharp as the rumor said. However, he still endured it. After a moment, he indifferently said, you're in charge of Fuyunji, so I think you should know my identity and background. Shuang sneered and said, of course I know. A few years ago, I even went to Qingshui village to secretly see you. Lu Chen was startled. He didn't have any impression of this woman in his memory. Presumably, Shuang had been spying on him without his knowledge. This gave him a strange feeling. However, now was not the time to think about these things. He looked at Shuang and said, you came here to stop me. Was it his idea? Who he was, Lu Chen didn't say, and Shuang didn't ask either. However, they both seemed to know in their hearts. Shuang only shook her head and said, now that things have come to this, even Fuyunji can't protect you from publicly using evil arts in the big city. We can only say that it has nothing to do with you. Even for the sake of our own Fengyu, after today, we might even arrange for people to come and kill you. Do you understand? Lu Chen's expression was normal. He nodded and said, I understand, I don't blame you. Shuang snorted, looking somewhat disdainful. However, the originally sharp gaze in the depths of her eyes seemed to have softened a little. Then, she took a step to the side and opened up half of the path. She said, you can go. In the future, if you're found by the evil sex demons, before you get caught, I advise you to kill yourself. Lu Chen strode forward, Atsu following closely behind him. As he walked past Shuang, Lu Chen's footsteps suddenly stopped. Atsu also quickly noticed and immediately stopped. Then, it bared its teeth and stared at Shuang with incomparable ferocity. Being stared at by such a murderous beast as if it wanted to devour someone, it really made one's heart palpitate. However, Shuang didn't seem to feel anything. Instead, she focused her gaze and stared back at Atsu. That gaze seemed to be even more ferocious and savage than the black wolf. It was as if in the next moment, this woman was prepared to skin the black wolf and cook it into a big pot of hot soup. Moreover, her aura instantly surged and actually directly suppressed Atsu. Atsu let out a whimper and jumped away in shock. As a demonic beast, its sensitivity to the strong far surpassed that of a human's. Atsu immediately ran forward, and in a single breath, he ran several zhang away before stopping. Then, with a lingering fear, he turned his head back and looked around. Lu Chen's expression didn't change. He only stood in front of Shuang and stared at her. Shuang turned her gaze from Atsu and looked at him calmly. What is it? Lu Chen said. I think there's something wrong with what you said earlier. Shuang said. Which one? Lu Chen said. Becoming a shadow, you will never see the light for the rest of your life. Shuang sneered and said, am I wrong? Lu Chen was silent for a long time. Then his voice became somewhat low. He said, I have been in the darkness for several decades. I want to go to a place where there is light to live. I really want to know what that feels like. After saying this, he directly turned around and walked past this beautiful and charming woman who was as sharp as a knife without looking back. Shuang stared at his back without saying a word. At this time, a gust of wind seemed to rise, blowing across the valley. A strand of Shui Ying's hair swayed slightly in the wind. Chapter 249. After watching the man and wolf leave, Shuang still stood in the same place. Her expression was plain and cold, as if Lu Chen's last words before he left had not touched her in the slightest. The wind blew through the gorge, and the trees on both sides of the mountain swayed. She was the only one left in the vast mountain range. After a while, a red shadow suddenly swept out from the mountain forest on her left. It descended from the sky, made a turn in the air, and landed lightly next to Shuang. "Sistering, why did you let him go?" The one who spoke was a woman dressed in red. Her features were picturesque, and she was also extremely beautiful. However, compared to Shui Ying's flirtatious and sharp beauty, this woman in red was a little less fierce, but more passionate. Even when she asked Shui Ying a question with some doubt, her face still had a somewhat passionate feeling, just like the red clothes she wore, bold and passionate. Shui Ying glanced at the woman in red, and her eyes clearly softened. However, she did not immediately answer her, and instead asked, "You think we shouldn't let him go?" "Of course," the woman in red said without hesitation. "This person has worked in our Fuyunji for many years. Let's not talk about how many people he knows, but he definitely knows some of our secrets. If he is captured by the evil cult, the consequences will be hard to control." Shui Ying was silent for a moment, but still shook her head and said, "Black Wolf has made great contributions to our Fuyunji, no to Zhengxianmeng and the entire righteous world. We can't treat him like those useless shadows who are just eating and waiting to die." The woman in red curled her lips, as if she did not agree. Shui Ying glanced at her and sighed and said, "You are still young, and have not experienced the bloody days of 10 years ago when the evil cult was still flourishing. You can't imagine it just by listening to stories." At this point, there seemed to be a trace of sadness on her face. She said softly, "No matter what, we still owe him." The lady in red appeared to be extremely respectful toward Shui Ying. Since Shui Ying had said so, she did not say anything more. Instead, after a moment of silence, she turned her head to look in the direction that Lu Qin had come from and said, "Since that is the case, the evil cult's pursuers who are chasing after He Lang will most likely be here soon. Should we leave or stay?" Shui Ying said indifferently, "You stay here and help him hold them off for 3 days." The red-clothed woman was stunned for a moment. She pulled on Shui Ying's sleeve and said, "Sistering, why did you give me this difficult task again?" "No, I want to go back to the Immortal City with you." Shui Ying waved her hand and said, "Things have changed recently, so I won't be returning to the Immortal City for now. I might have to go to the Western Continent's Kunlun Mountain. There's no point in you following me. What's more, it's very difficult to defend a place now. There will be evil cult's demons coming to us. We can use this opportunity to cut off some of the evil cult's wings. I'll leave this matter to you." The red-clothed woman grunted. It seemed that she was not afraid of the bloody and murderous task that Shui Ying had given her. She had a calm expression on her face. However, she quickly asked, "Then what about after this matter is finished? Should I return to the Immortal City first or go to the Kunlun Mountain to find you?" Shui Ying hesitated for a moment and said, "You go to the disorienting land and follow He Lang." The red-clothed woman was shocked and said, "Why? Could it be that you want me to protect him?" Shui Ying shook her head and said, "That's not it. Just follow that person. No matter what happens, you don't need to do anything. I'll contact you after I go to the Western Continent. At that time, whether you leave or stay, or treat him, we'll see when the time comes." The red-clothed woman nodded, but her expression changed slightly. Shui Ying was a meticulous woman. After glancing at her, she said, "What's wrong?" The red-clothed woman hesitated for a moment and said, "Sistering, didn't you just say that we owe him? If that's the case, it's understandable that you want me to protect him. But why do I hear that last sentence of yours? It seems like it might be disadvantageous to him as well." Shui Ying fell silent and did not speak for a long time. Just when the red-clothed woman was a little worried that she had said something wrong, Shui Ying sighed and said, "Whether we owe him or not, it's not up to me to decide. Isn't it just a word from our superiors?" The red-clothed woman was slightly startled after hearing this. Then a trace of sympathy appeared on her face and she said in a low voice, "If that's the case, then that man is really quite pitiful." Shui Ying suddenly seemed to be a little dispirited. She waved her hand and said, "Do your own thing." After saying this, she turned around and walked out of the canyon. Her speed seemed slow, but it was actually very fast. Not long after, she had gone far away. The red-clothed woman was left standing there, but she looked around in high spirits. Then, she turned her head and looked into the depths of the canyon. In front of the canyon was the world's most dangerous place, the disorienting land. She suddenly smiled. as if she was a little more interested in that direction. Ever since they entered the disorienting land, Luchin suddenly felt the pressure on his body lighten a lot. Relying on his familiarity with the disorienting land, he led the black wolf Atsu and fled into the depths of the disorienting land. It had been several days since he sensed any devil cult killers approaching from behind. Even so, the string of tension in Lu Chen's heart did not loosen. Because in this world, no one understood the true craziness and danger of the devil cult followers of the three realms better than him. Generally speaking, if one wanted to enter the disorienting land from the passage around Crescent City and Longhu Mountain, if one wanted to go deeper into the disorienting land, the most common path would be the Black Armor Mountain's Cyan Sunflower Cave. It could lead to the famous Desolate Valley, and it could also reach the Dragon River that separated the periphery of the disorienting land from the central region. This was the path that ordinary cultivators would choose under most circumstances. It was relatively safe and easy to travel. However, after walking in the direction of the Black Armor Mountain for a day, Lu Chen gave up on this idea and led the Atsu in another direction. One man and one wolf walked for a few days in the vast wilderness of the Land of Chaos, traversing through the primitive forests and rivers. After making a huge detour, they finally arrived at the lower reaches of a large river. They then began to walk up from the bottom. It was a journey along the shore of a wide and calm river. There were many dangers along the way, and many ferocious demonic beasts appeared. However, relying on Atu, who was now powerful, and Lu Chen, who was gradually recovering his strength, the two of them still managed to make it through without any danger. Until they arrived at a river valley. Standing at the entrance of the river valley and looking into the distance, they could see a tall mountain peak. If Lu Chen remembered correctly, that should be the Black Armor Mountain. In the river valley in front of them, under the illumination of the sun, there was a sea of dazzling and beautiful flowers in full bloom, as if they were blooming brilliantly in the sun. Everything seemed to float in front of them again, as if it was yesterday. Lu Chen stood quietly at the entrance of the river valley, gazing at the sea of flowers. The Atsu stood beside him with a somewhat gloomy expression. Occasionally, it would growl a few times uneasily, wagging its tail, and move closer to Lu Chen. Lu Chen nodded and sighed softly. He then reached out and touched the head of the Atsu, saying, let's go to the place where you first appeared." Of course, no one knew where Atsu was first born. Even the Atsu probably didn't have this memory. But that day, when Lu Chen and Exian passed through this river valley full of blood-devouring demon flowers, it was indeed the first time they saw the Atsu. Those days seemed to be fresh in their memory, as if it was yesterday, but now things were the same, but people had changed. Lu Chen and the Atsu walked along the edge of the river valley, always keeping a safe distance from the beautiful but extremely dangerous blood-devouring demon flowers. In the middle, Lu Chen had also seen the open space where the dying puppy was used as bait. But now it was flat without a trace, as if nothing had happened. Where was the person? If a person died, would it be as if nothing had happened? The beauty would vanish like smoke, and after all the prosperity was gone, there would only be a bleak cold wind blowing past. Lu Chen didn't know if there was an answer to this question. He just walked silently towards the forest. The Atsu followed behind him, raised its head and sniffed the air a few times. Suddenly, it let out a low growl, as if it was a little angry. They walked through the forest all the way. Although it had been a long time, and the forest was full of weeds and thorns, Lu Chen still seemed to remember the path they walked through here. He led the Atsu around the strange rocks and trees in the forest, and then came to the side of the cave. Roar! Atu became even more agitated. His sharp teeth kept grinding against each other, making a terrifying sound. His eyes shone with a cold light as he scanned the surroundings of the cave. He looked like he was about to devour anyone who stood in his way. Lu Chen jumped down and looked around. He saw that the place was still full of strange rocks, but it seemed to have been abandoned for a long time. There was a lot of dust at the entrance of the cave, and he didn't know how long it had been since someone came in or out of it. He seemed to think of something and turned to look in a certain direction. At this time, the Atsu also jumped to his side and looked in the same direction. Then their eyes stopped at a certain place at the same time. In the pile of rocks on the riverbank, A white bone was vaguely exposed. The Atsu growled, and Lu Chen nodded and walked over. The rocks gradually dispersed in front of his eyes. Under the sunlight, he saw a terrifying skeleton among the rocks. However, it was now scattered beyond recognition. Moreover, there were obvious bite marks on many of the bones. Lu Chen looked at the skeleton for a moment, expressionless, then turned to the Atsu and said lightly, "Let's go." He stepped over the skeleton, walked to the distance of the riverbank, and walked to the unknown forest in front of him, which no one had ever stepped into. In front of him, maybe it was the place where the barbarian came from. The Atsu shouted behind him and followed. When it walked past the pile of rocks, it stepped on the skull with one of its feet, and with a bang, the white skull was broken into pieces, and then it went far away. Chapter 250. The sudden battle on the night of the full moon was a great fright for Kunwa City, which had been peaceful for a long time. But to be honest, the destruction caused by this battle couldn't be considered particularly large. It was nothing more than some buildings collapsing, and a few unlucky people who happened to get close to the muzzle of the gun and died gloomily. The reason for this situation was that the two parties involved in the battle, the Kunlun party and the Devil cult, were mostly young disciples. Although there were some outstanding disciples, they were generally a bit weaker. On the Kunlun party's side, there was a secret. Most of the powerful and profound Taoist master Yuanying were pinned down on Heavenly Kuan Peak. Compared to the threat of the Devil cult, the matter they had to face that night was more tense and urgent. On the Devil cult side, their strength had probably been damaged in the past 10 years. Few Yuanying experts with strong Taoist magic appeared, or even if there were experts, they were afraid of the Kunlun party's strength and didn't dare to make a move. As for the real reason, only the Devil cult themselves knew. In short, after the battle on the night of the full moon, although Kunwa City was in a state of panic for a while, it was still the territory of the Kunlun party. In the following days, the Kunlun party ruthlessly sifted this lively city and cleaned up many of the shadows that were originally hiding in the dark. As the saying goes, how can one allow others to sleep beside one's bed? The Kunlun party was one of the top sects in the world, so it was impossible for them to allow the Devil cult to develop their power next to them. As a result, the Devil cult spies in Kunwa City were almost wiped out. After all, Kunwa City was a place where the Kunlun party had operated for countless years. They were deeply rooted in every aspect and infiltrated everywhere. Once a serious investigation was carried out, the majority of the Devil cult spies wouldn't be able to hide. Following such a big movement, Kunwa City also quickly settled down. The dead were buried, the collapsed houses were rebuilt, and everything returned to its original appearance. It was bustling, flourishing, and flourishing as if nothing had ever happened. And what happened that night also became the topic of people's after-dinner conversations. Since ancient times, as long as it had nothing to do with them, in the eyes and hearts of most people in the world, it would end up like this. In the end, the big event would become a small matter, and then it would become a dry and colorless impression in their memories. But to those who were there, experienced that cruel battle, and witnessed death with their own eyes, those memories were completely different. They were filled with sorrow, anger, and hatred that was difficult to suppress. On that night, the Su family in Kunwa City was one of the places that suffered the most damage in the whole city. Their gate fell, their high walls collapsed, and in the end many people died. Logically speaking, everyone only had one life, but there was no such thing as absolute fairness in this world. In everyone's eyes, some people's lives were more important and precious than others. After that night, the Su family sank into a gloomy atmosphere. Many people in their family died, but everyone seemed to only pay attention to the dead young man named Sumo, because he was the son of the head of the Su family and Su Qingjuan's younger brother. White cloths were hung on the door, wreaths were piled up, and elegiac couplets were filled with sad eulogies that were both sincere and hypocritical. A coffin made of red nanmu was placed in front of the Su family's mourning hall. Over there, Sumo's mother's face was covered in tears, crying herself hoarse. Sumo's father, Su Tianhe, was handling many chores in front of the hall. As the head of the Su family and a man, he was obviously much more unyielding than his wife. But even so, his expression was extremely haggard. In addition to them, many members of the Su family were also in front of the mourning hall. Most of them were dressed in white, handling the unusually sad funeral affairs. Then, listening to the bitter wail of Madame Bai, all of them had complicated expressions and looked at each other from time to time. "Son, you died so miserably. It's a pity that you suffered such an unexpected disaster at such a young age. God is really blind. Why didn't the person who should die die, but let me, the white-haired person, see the black-haired person die?" The crying was extremely sharp, as if it was a sharp thorn that made people feel uncomfortable. Many people at the side frowned, but no one dared to speak. And compared to the grandeur of this mourning hall, the people who died at the same time that night were not so lucky. At this time no one knew where they were. Either they had no funeral affairs and were hastily buried, or they were casually held by their own family members. While the place was bustling, a figure suddenly walked in from outside. It was Su Qingjun. Her body looked much thinner than before, and her face was still pale. It seemed that the injuries she had suffered that day had not healed. But to her, the injuries on her body were probably not important. Her entire appearance seemed to be much colder than before. Seeing Su Qingjun walk into the mourning hall, the surrounding people immediately quieted down. For a moment, only Madame Bai was still crying and screaming in front of her. At this moment, Su Qingjun was also dressed in white. She looked around, and her gaze finally fell on the coffin above the mourning hall and the crying mother. Her eyes could not help but redden a little, and she slowly walked over. She squatted behind Madame Bai and gently hugged her body. Madame Bai leaned against her chest, still crying nonstop, her mouth hoarsely crying nonstop. It seemed that Sumo's death was a great blow to her. Su Qingjun took a deep breath, wiped her eyes and then softly said, "Mother, please restrain your grief. Otherwise your body." "What's wrong with my body?" Madame Bai suddenly stopped crying and asked coldly. Standing to the side, Su Tianhe seemed to feel something, frowned slightly, and turned to look at her. Su Qingjun was startled and said, "You have been crying here for 2 days. You should rest, or your body will not be able to take it." "If I can't take it, then just die." Madame Bai suddenly threw herself to the side of the coffin and cried. Su Qingjun hurriedly pulled her back and tried to persuade her, but her mouth was almost dry. But there was no reaction from Madame Bai. Instead, after a short pause, Madame Bai suddenly turned to glare at her, and a trace of hatred and anger appeared in her eyes. Su Qingjun was shocked and said, "Mother, why are you looking at me like this? Let me ask you, why didn't you save Mo? Why did you watch him die?" Madame Bai suddenly raised her voice and asked loudly to Su Qingjun. Su Qingjun's head buzzed, and it seemed that she couldn't react for a moment. She looked at her mother in shock, and the large group of people in the mourning hall instantly fell silent. After a moment, Su Qingjun said with a trembling voice, "Mother, no, it's not like that." Madame Bai suddenly stood up and stared at Su Qingjun with a distorted face and shouted, "I saw it clearly that day. You obviously had the upper hand in the battle with that scoundrel. Why did you suddenly lose? Also, that scoundrel clearly knew you. He originally wanted to kill your father and me, but you stopped him. Why didn't you stop him from killing Mo?" Su Qingjun's mouth was half open, and she wanted to say something, but stopped. There was sorrow and pain on her face, and after a moment, 2 clear lines of tears flowed down. She just shook her head and smiled bitterly, and said in a low voice, "Mother, it's not like that." The surrounding crowd was in an uproar, and the sound of discussion instantly merged into a wave of sound. At this moment, who knew how many people were looking at Su Qingjun with a strange gaze? The originally high and mighty woman, who was already a genius of Jindan Friar at such a young age, at this moment, it seemed that she could be despised and discussed at will, like a beautiful jade covered in dust, and everyone couldn't help but want to trample on her. "Enough!" There was a shout, and it was Su Tianhe who strode over. His face was dark, but he looked around, and then directly waved his hand, saying, "Everyone, please leave for a moment. Our family has something to say." He had been in charge of the Su family for many years, and people had always been in awe of him. Although this action was a little unreasonable in front of the mourning hall, in the end, Everyone slowly left. When only the three of them were left in the morning hall, Su Tianhe's expression eased a little. He silently glanced at his wife who was standing next to him in tears, and after a sigh, he said, June, was just trying to persuade you out of kindness. Why did you deliberately embarrass her in front of so many people? Madame Bai's face was gloomy. She suddenly pointed at the coffin and cried, Is what I said wrong? Is lying in there now, without a complete corpse, and his body has been separated from his body, and his body has been stabbed so many times. Isn't he pitiful? As his sister, don't you feel even a little bit guilty? She said the last sentence to Su Qingjun while crying. Su Qingjun clenched her teeth, but did not say a word. Su Tianhe looked at his wife, who seemed to have gone mad, and then looked at Su Qingjun. He let out a long sigh, and then pulled Su Qingjun to the side of the morning hall. After they were a little further away from Madame Bai, Su Tianhe lowered his voice and said, June, when Moer's funeral is finished, you should go back to Kunlun Mountain. Su Qingjun's body shook, and her face was pale. She trembled and said, Father, do you also blame me? Do you not want me anymore? Su Tianhe shook his head and said, Moer's death, of course, I am also heartbroken, but not to the extent of losing my mind. Su Qingjun shed tears and said, Then why did you ask me to leave the family? Shouldn't you ask me to stay here to help you? Su Tianhe smiled bitterly and said, There's nothing to help. That's all there is to it. In fact, the Su family will be handed over to you sooner or later, and the others are not worth mentioning. He paused and said, I asked you to leave first, mainly because I don't want to provoke your mother. She loved Mo, the most in her life, and Moer's death is a great blow to her. You should stay away for the time being. Su Qingjun said in a low voice, Then when can I come back? Su Tianhe shook his head and said, I don't know, maybe. A glimmer of hope appeared on Su Qingjun's face and she asked, Maybe what? Su Tianhe glanced at Madame Bai in the distance, and his eyes flickered slightly. He said softly, You have seen your mother. She has lost her mind, and I am also worried that something will happen to her. Maybe, if you can avenge Sumo, you will treat her better, and you can come back at any time. Su Qingjun's body trembled slightly, and then she quickly fell silent. Chapter 251. Su Tianhe immediately sensed something and said, Why? You don't want to? He frowned and looked at his daughter, saying in a low voice, It can't be as your mother said, that you really have something to do with the murderer, right? Su Qingjun shook her head and said bitterly, No. Su Tianhe stared at her for a while and said slowly, June, your talent and aptitude far surpass mine, and your future achievements are limitless. Now that Mo has passed away, the Su family will be handed over to you sooner or later. The thief who killed Mo has a very high cultivation and evil arts. In the Su family, only you can hope to defeat him. In the future, the matter of revenge can only be handed over to you. Do you understand? Su Qingjun's face was pale, and even her lips seemed to be drained of blood. But after a while, she finally took a deep breath and said in a low voice, I understand. Then you go. Su Tianhe's expression softened and said. Su Qingjun turned around woodenly and slowly walked out of the morning hall. After watching her walk away, Su Tianhe shook his head and walked back to Madame Bai's side. He squatted down next to her and hugged her shoulders gently. All right, did you hear what I said just now? Madame Bai's eyes lit up. Madame Bai's crying slowly stopped. After a while she said faintly, Will Qingjun really avenge Moer? Su Tianhe said, I don't know. In fact, now that the thief is a fugitive, it is still a question whether we can find him in the future. Who can say for sure? A sad expression flashed across Madame Bai's face again, but she held it back this time and just nodded. Then she looked at the door of the morning hall and said in a low voice, So Qingjun will suffer? Su Tianhe said expressionlessly, We are doing this for her own good. She will understand in the future. As Lu Chen led Atsa deeper into the disorientated lands, he could clearly feel the 5 elemental energies around him becoming chaotic. Even though they weren't at the Dragon River, which meant that they were still in the outskirts of the disorientated lands, the spiritual energy circulation of ordinary cultivators was already beginning to be affected. In comparison, Atsu didn't seem to feel anything. They could run, jump, eat, drink, and sleep every day. Lu Chen initially thought that this was because demonic beasts were naturally different from humans. However, he soon recalled that the demonic beasts in other parts of the Divine Continent were different from those in the Land of Chaos. It was probably because the demonic beasts living in this chaotic and dangerous place had mutated into something different. It seemed that the blood and bones of Atsu originated from this vast but chaotic land, which was why they were able to adapt so naturally. The further they went, the more dangers they encountered along the way. All kinds of strange plants and demonic beasts would appear from time to time. However, Lu Chen and Atsu didn't seem to be weak in combat. Lu Chen, who was gradually recovering from his serious injuries, was very familiar with the situation in the disorientated lands. He was familiar with most of the dangers in the disorientated lands, including all kinds of strange plants and animals. That was why he was able to avoid many dangers. On the other hand, Atsu's situation was different. When Lu Chen first met up with it, Atsu obviously wasn't used to its new body and acted clumsily most of the time. However, as time passed, Atsu's coordination improved, and its combat strength increased almost every day. Its strength grew day by day, and its movements became more agile. Nowadays, it was rare to see this black wolf fiercely pouncing on its prey, and then clumsily pouncing to the side to pounce on empty air. Instead, whenever Atsu pounced over, there would be a reign of terror. Its sharp teeth and claws could almost tear apart any demon beast that appeared. Along the way, Atsu also had a teacher. When Lu Chen had nothing better to do, he would grab hold of Atsu and teach it some sinister hunting methods. He taught it how to hide in the dark and suddenly jump out to attack, how to stab the eyes and then kick the balls, how to bite the belly, and even how to pretend to be injured and fall to the ground in a fight. Lu Chen even tried to teach Atsu a sinister method of pretending to be injured and falling to the ground to lure the opponent over, and then suddenly bite the opponent's throat. Atsu was very smart. It learned these insidious fighting techniques as soon as it learned them. From then on, the demonic beasts in the disorientated lands that blocked their way started to have bad luck. Those ferocious, strong and huge demonic beasts would often be killed while they were walking, ambushed while they were hunting, and when they suddenly found out that their opponent had been defeated by them, they would happily walk over to feast on their prey. Then they would be bitten in the throat, kicked in the balls, and beaten to death, often dying with their eyes wide open. After leaving the riverside cave where the barbarian had died, they headed south. There were many hills and rivers along the way. Poisonous insects, birds, and beasts could be found everywhere. The road was difficult to walk on and slowed down their speed. However, it was probably because there were few people in this area that Lu Chen did not find any pursuers or killers following them. It was not surprising that the people from the Kunlun party did not chase after them. However, the fact that the killers from the devil cult did not follow them really surprised Lu Chen. He was well aware of his weight in the hearts of the followers of the devil cult. It could be said that he was a person that they would not rest until he was dead. After the initial doubts, he quickly thought of Xue Ying, whom he had met before. Did she help them secretly? After all, she was probably from Fuyunji. Was this considered a form of nostalgia? Lu Chen did not know. He did not understand Xue Ying, but no matter what, this was indeed very beneficial to him. It also gave him very precious time to rest. So, after walking for another 2 to 3 days, he saw a very strange-looking forest ahead. Suddenly, he discovered movement behind him. He had been a shadow for too long, and lived in the dark world for too many years. He seemed to have an innately sharp intuition towards these kinds of pursuers. It could not be helped. If he did not have this ability, he would probably have died in some dark corner many years ago. He felt movement behind him, and it was not a ferocious and dangerous demonic beast, but a human's aura. Lu Chen's expression changed slightly. He did not expect that after using all the means he had to escape, and even with the possible secret help from Fuyunji, he still could not shake off the pursuers. However, his expression did not change much. He just reached out his hand and patted the head of the giant wolf beside him. Then, as if inadvertently, he used his finger and lightly flicked Atsu's ear twice. Atsu turned his head to look at Lu Chen. Lu Chen quietly gave a look in the direction of the dense forest beside him. Atsu growled in a low voice. After taking 2 steps forward, he suddenly turned his body and scuttled into the forest beside him. As for Lu Chen, he did not make any more movements. He only shouted for Atsu to not run around, and then walked forward himself. At the same time, he shouted for Atsu to follow him. Atsu seemed to be playing around in the forest, and did not immediately run out. Lu Chen, on the other hand, slowly walked forward with a calm expression. Suddenly, a whistling sound came from behind him, and a snow-white light flashed past, striking towards his back. At the same time, a figure poked his head out from the bushes behind him. Lu Chen leapt forward, dodging the attack. At the same time, he heard an angry roar, and from the other side of the forest, a huge black shadow suddenly rushed over. Black Wolf Atu was like an enraged beast, directly pouncing towards the figure that had suddenly appeared. Then, with its sharp teeth and claws, it greeted the figure coldly. It looked like the ground was about to be splattered with blood. But at this moment, the figure behind suddenly let out a scream. The ray of light in midair flickered for a moment and disappeared. In the next moment, it suddenly appeared in front of the figure and blocked Atu's terrifying pounce by a hair's breadth. Atsu was furious. During this period of time, it had long been used to this kind of hunting and sneak attack. Usually it was always successful. Today was the first time it failed. That could be tolerated, but the wolf absolutely could not. With a howl, Atsu almost stood up, and was about to pounce on the figure. Then it really pounced on her. Then the figure was angry. Somehow, it dodged the sharp teeth and claws of Atsu, and slapped over. There was a faint sound of wind and snow. With a paw sound, it hit the mouth of Atsu. It was like a slap, and then it shouted, "Stupid dog, do you want to rebel?" Atsu was stunned for a moment. When it took a closer look, it saw that under its body was an amazing and beautiful little girl. Impressively, it was White Lotus. Atsu seemed to have a natural fear of this mysterious little girl from the bottom of its heart. This was not a trivial matter. It directly jumped up and jumped back to Lu Chen's side. The sound of its mouth actually turned into woof woof woof, and it barked a few times in succession. This made Lu Chen, who was also a little surprised to see that it was White Lotus, turn his head to look at it in even more surprise. After a moment of silence, Lu Chen asked, "Stupid dog, didn't you become a wolf? Why can you still bark like a dog?" Atsu snorted as if it was disdainful, and looked at Lu Chen with contempt. Lu Chen shook his head and ignored it. Then he turned his head to look at White Lotus, only to see that the little girl was standing up from the ground, and reaching out to pat the dust off her body. Lu Chen smiled bitterly and said, "Why are you here?" After saying that, he suddenly frowned and said, "That's right, how did you find us?" White Lotus sneered and said, "Finding you is not difficult at all. That stupid dog has the blood food secret technique. In the eyes of people like us who are knowledgeable, this thing is as bright as a lamp at night. Those who can't see it are the blind ones." Lu Chen's face sank and he shook his head saying, "Forget it, let's not care about this. You, a little girl, suddenly chased us deep into the chaotic lands. What are you doing? The demonic beasts in the chaotic lands do not recognize any 5-pillar geniuses. If you are not careful and die here, it will be too late for you and your true monarch master to cry." White Lotus smiled, looking pure and innocent, but there was an indescribable strangeness in her beauty. She smiled and said, "Are you talking about that dead master of mine?" Chapter 252. Lu Chen was startled and frowned. Back then, on the night of the full moon, when Mount Kunlun changed, he did not know that something had happened to Hakushin Jinkuen. However, when he saw the great changes in the sky and the collapse of Winter Peak, Lu Chen actually had some premonition, but he had not confirmed it. These days he had been chased by both the righteous and evil sections. He had been on the run all the way to the land of chaos, and did not have a chance to inquire about this news. When he arrived at the land of chaos, firstly, it was vast and sparsely populated. Secondly, he deliberately avoided crowds and went to remote and dangerous places. So he really did not have a chance to ask about this matter. He did not expect to hear this news from White Lotus today. No matter what, White Lotus's master was not an ordinary person. He was a divine transformation stage perfected lord who stood at the peak of the human race's martial strength. There were less than 10 of them in the entire world. Every divine transformation stage perfected lord could be said to be a famous authority in the world. Even the slightest movement would attract attention from everywhere, let alone their death. Hakushin Jinkuan's death was undoubtedly a great blow to the strength of the Kunlun party. However, there was a silver lining in the misfortune. The Kunlun party was, after all, a 1,000-year-old sect with a deep foundation. Other than the deceased Hakushin Jinkuan, there was still perfected Lord Tianlan. Otherwise, the death of a perfected lord could directly reduce the strength of a large sect by a level. In addition, there were some differences between the two perfected lords of the Kunlun party. Hakushin Jinkuan had been famous for a long time, and was now very old. Even at the level of a perfected lord, he could be considered to have one foot in the grave. On the contrary, his junior brother perfected Lord Tianlan could be considered to be in the prime of his life. Whether it was his body, cultivation, knowledge, temperament, reputation, or so on, he was almost at the peak of his prime. This was also the reason why, although Hakushin Jinkuan had died, the foundation of the Kunlun party was not damaged. These thoughts flashed across his mind, but Luchin did not show it on his face. He only said to White Lotus, "Your master Hakushin Jinkuan has passed away? This is a huge matter. Why didn't you stay on the mountain of Kunlun to observe your filial piety? Why did you come to the wilderness of the disorienting lands?" White Lotus pursed her lips. There was a hint of ridicule on her face, but it wasn't directed at Luchin. She casually waved her hand and said, "If he died, then he died. If he really had a filial heart, Master wouldn't care if I kowtowed a few times in front of his coffin. More importantly, if I return to Kunlun Mountain after his death, it's hard to say what will happen to me." Lu Chen's face darkened. He looked at White Lotus and pondered for a moment. Slowly, the light in his eyes gradually brightened. That night, although Lu Chen was also on the mountain of Kunlun Mountain, he had brushed past the soul-stirring incident of the Kunlun party. He was like an outsider. At this moment, when he heard White Lotus's words, he seemed to have thought of something. "You seem to suspect the people of the Kunlun party?" Lu Chen asked White Lotus. White Lotus snorted and said, "I'm not an idiot. After the two of us parted that night, I walked towards the winter peak for a while. Even before I reached there, I felt that something was wrong. Then one after another, I secretly heard that Master died in battle and eldest martial brother was seriously injured, and went into closed-door meditation. It would be a joke to say that there's nothing wrong here." Lu Chen nodded slowly. There was a bit of appreciation in his eyes as he looked at this little girl. However, he still couldn't help but say, "Since you feel that something is wrong and don't want to stay on the mountain of Kunlun Mountain, you should go back to your hometown, the Bai clan in Kunwa City. There are always your elders and family members there who can take care of you." White Lotus had a disapproving look on her face, and even had a trace of contempt. She said, "If someone in the Kunlun party really wants to harm me, you wouldn't think that the Bai clan can handle it, right?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "That's true. The Bai clan definitely can't handle someone who can arm wrestle with your master and senior martial brother." White Lotus said, "Not only can't they handle it, but there are also no good people in that clan. If someone really forces them too much, maybe that family will turn around and send me there to take credit. I won't go to the Bai clan unless my brain is damaged." Lu Chen looked at her with interest. He only felt that this excessively beautiful little girl seemed to be more and more mysterious and suspicious. He said with a smile, "That's your hometown. What? From what you see, you also have a lot of dissatisfaction with the Bai clan." White Lotus was about to open her mouth and seemed to want to complain for a while, but she suddenly became alert. She glanced at Lu Chen and coldly snorted, "It's none of your business." Lu Chen laughed and said, "Hey little girl, don't be so vulgar." White Lotus ignored him and walked straight to Atsu's side. She reached out her hand to touch its head. Today Atsu was a huge black wolf. Just by standing, it seemed to be taller than White Lotus. But White Lotus didn't look afraid at all. Instead, she was interested in touching the smooth fur on Atsu's head. Atu's expression was also very strange. He seemed to want to leave, but he also seemed to feel comfortable. He hesitated, but in the end he still stood there without moving. He probably felt that this mysterious and fierce little girl did not have any hostility towards him. In Kunlun Mountain, the relationship between Lu Chen and White Lotus had always been very subtle. On the surface, they maintained a peaceful relationship. But in private, they had fought to the death several times. Their actions were also extremely ruthless. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were mortal enemies. But now, in the chaotic land far away from Kunlun Mountain, in this dangerous, vast, and sparsely populated wilderness, the atmosphere between the two of them seemed to be a lot more peaceful. At most, they just quarreled a little, but they didn't have the intention to fight anymore. But even so, when Lu Chen was about to leave with Atsu, he saw White Lotus following him calmly as if nothing had happened. He couldn't help but roll his eyes and said, "I say, why do you keep following me?" White Lotus said matter-of-factly, "Tell me the secret of the blood food secret method, and I won't pester you." Lu Chen sneered and said, "You're just a little girl, but not only do you know the blood food secret method, you also know so many sinister methods and magical powers. Why don't you tell me the origin of these secrets first?" White Lotus shook her head and said, "I can't tell you." Lu Chen said, "Then why should I tell you? Besides, this method is originally a plaything of the southern barbarians. It's incompatible with our Central Earth's Tao method and magical powers. Even if you don't know about it, it doesn't matter. Why do you care so much about it?" White Lotus wanted to say something but hesitated. She glanced at Lu Chen and shook her head. "Why do you always have a belly full of evil tricks? Why do you always try to get information from a little girl like me?" Lu Chen laughed and turned around to walk away. He said, "If you don't want to tell me, I can't force you. But this chaotic land is full of unfathomable dangers. If we go deeper, even I don't dare to be careless. My life could be in danger at any time. Although you have some skills, you're still a child. You also have a clan in Kunwa City. Why do you need to run here and suffer? If you die here without rhyme or reason, wouldn't it be too unjust?" White Lotus thought for a moment but still followed him. She then calmly said, "I don't have anyone close to me in my clan. Since I was a child, no one has taken a liking to me. It's just that their temperament suddenly changed after they found out I have the 5-pillar divine disc. It's annoying. In any case, it's rare for me to come out. This carefree life is much more comfortable than living in Kunlun." Lu Chen smiled and said, "Then why don't you go by yourself? Wouldn't that be more carefree? The world is so big. You can go anywhere and do whatever you want to do." White Lotus shook her head. After a pause, she said in a slightly gloomy voice, "After coming out, it seems like you're the only person I know in the whole world. In any case, I have nothing to do. I'll just follow you for a while." Lu Chen was startled. For a moment he didn't know what to say. The words he wanted to say suddenly couldn't come out. He was silent for a moment. Then he suddenly laughed at himself. He thought to himself that he was indeed much more soft-hearted than the cold and emotionless assassin from 10 years ago. His mood suddenly became somewhat gloomy. However, he felt a little closer to White Lotus. Perhaps it was the loneliness of youth that reminded him of his painful childhood. So he slowly walked forward, no longer chasing White Lotus away. At the same time, he casually asked, "Don't you have any close relatives in your family? What about your parents?" White Lotus said, "They died before I was born." Lu Chen laughed in spite of himself. "If they died before you were born, then there wouldn't be you." White Lotus was startled for a moment. Then she also laughed. Perhaps she also felt that what she said was a little silly. Or perhaps her relationship with her parents was too shallow. So she shrugged her shoulders and said, I'm wrong. They died before I became sensible. That's why I don't remember what they look like." "Do you miss them?" Lu Chen pushed away a branch in front of him. He took 2 steps forward. However, he only saw a complex terrain of intersecting mountains and valleys. At the same time, there was a very gloomy and dense forest in front of him. Most of the trees in this forest were dark brown. The trunks were tall, and the crowns were luxuriant. However, The strange thing was that there were vines of various sizes hanging everywhere in the forest. Most of them were hanging on the branches of different heights. Many of them were growing on the ground of the forest. But other than that, there wasn't much abnormality. Lu Chen stared at the forest, and his brows suddenly furrowed. At this time, White Lotus also walked to his side and said, "I don't miss them." Lu Chen was slightly surprised. He looked at her and said, "Why? People have feelings for their children. It's natural. No matter what, it's your parents who gave birth to you. Why don't you miss them?" White Lotus snorted and said, "Since they gave birth to me, shouldn't they raise me and take care of me? They didn't have the ability and died early, leaving me to suffer alone. Why should I remember their kindness?" Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, "Perhaps they also have their difficulties?" White Lotus didn't seem to want to talk about this topic anymore. She walked straight forward and said, "What difficulties does a dead person have?" Chapter 253. Okay. Lu Chen seemed to have finally admitted defeat, and gave up the idea of driving White Lotus away. "If you want to follow me, then follow me. But I have to say something first. If you encounter any danger, such as a killer suddenly jumping out from the side to attack you, you're on your own." White Lotus stopped and glanced at him. She sneered and said, "Who are you trying to scare? Let me tell you Before he could finish his sentence, he suddenly heard a sharp whistling sound. Several figures suddenly rushed out from the nearby forest. They were all dressed in black and held sharp blades in their hands. The sharp blades reflected a cold light that made people tremble with fear. Without saying a word, they directly slashed at him. The attack was extremely fierce. More than half of the attack was aimed at Lu Chen, while the rest was aimed at White Lotus and Atsu. Bai Lian jumped in fright. She tapped the ground with the tip of her foot and quickly retreated. At the same time she shrieked, "I have nothing to do with him." Before she could finish speaking, the blades were already right in front of her. It was obvious that these black-clothed men were determined to kill everyone here no matter what. White Lotus was so angry that her eyes were on fire, but she could do nothing. After cursing, she suddenly lowered her head and floated back a few feet. At the same time, she waved her hand. In an instant, the surrounding air quickly cooled down. Some frost and snow drifted through her fingertips. Some of the green branches and leaves closest to her actually turned white, as if affected by the sudden cold current. The black-clothed man who was rushing over slowed down for a moment. However, that person seemed to be experienced. He snorted coldly behind the black cloth and shook his arms slightly. In an instant, the icicles and snowflakes that appeared on the blade scattered in all directions and scattered all over the sky. However, the sharp and cold blade still ruthlessly chopped down. It looked like this incomparably beautiful little girl was about to be chopped into two with a single stroke. White Lotus's eyes shone brightly. In an instant, there seemed to be wind and snow drifting through her pupils. Her clothes fluttered even though there was no wind. A cold current flowed out from her body. On the other side, Lu Chen, who had also been surrounded by several black-clothed men, glanced at White Lotus. There was a little surprise in his eyes. He whispered to himself, "Ice Snow Scripture? As expected of a five-pillar genius. This talent is really amazing." There were quite a few more black-robed men surrounding him compared to Bai Lian's group. They were all glaring at Lu Chen like they were about to spit fire. Their hatred was immeasurable, as if every single one of them wanted nothing more than to tear him to shreds. No matter who it was not a comfortable thing to be stared at by so many people with such crazy and hateful gazes. Everyone would feel fear and disgust. However, at this moment, Lu Chen's expression was still expressionless. There was no sadness or joy. It was as if he was an emotionless stone person. This kind of indifferent attitude, in turn, stimulated the black-clothed men around him. In the midst of the angry curses, who knew how many soul-chasing blades of light slashed over, Lu Chen's footsteps were nimble and elegant like the wind. He avoided the attacks of the three people in front of him, but when he retreated, he forgot that there was still someone behind him. The black-clothed man was shocked at first, then delighted. He stabbed forward with his blade, but just as he raised his arm, a huge shadow fell from the sky. It covered his eyes and instantly threw him to the ground. The smell of blood instantly spread. The terrifying and fierce giant wolf suddenly raised its head. Its front legs were still pressing down on the black-clothed man who was struggling desperately on the ground. Dark red blood flowed from its huge mouth. There was a big hole in the black-clothed man's neck. Blood was gushing out. It seemed that it was difficult for him to survive. The surrounding black-clothed men were taken aback. But for these killers who came from the evil cult, it was obvious that this little bit of blood was not enough to scare them away. After a moment, several black-clothed men came together again. This time, even Atsu was surrounded. "Traitor, die!" A shout that seemed to contain a trace of madness rang out from the black-clothed people's mouths. Lu Chen's face was gloomy as he coldly looked at these vicious and valiant killers who were like lunatics. Once upon a time, he was also one of them. Lu Chen's eyes had begun to ignite with black flames. He then walked towards them. The sword swallowed and spat. The black flames crisscrossed. This battle at the edge of the Black Forest lasted for about half an hour. The final result was that the black-clothed men left behind a few corpses. The rest of them retreated. Lu Chen's side was not good either. There were 3 more wounds on his body. Blood was flowing. Even the wounds that were almost healed a few days ago were either broken again, or were scratched with new wounds. In contrast, although White Lotus's situation looked a little embarrassing, it was better than Lu Chen's. At least she was not seriously injured. Her face was a little pale. She stood in the same place and gasped for breath. It seemed that she had exhausted all her strength. That was the manifestation of a large amount of spiritual power consumption. Compared to these 2 people, Black Wolf Atsu was obviously better. There was almost no injury on its body. Not even a knife wound could be seen. Probably those black-clothed men focused on Lu Chen and White Lotus, so they did not have time to greet it. After the battle, Lu Chen sat tiredly on a tree stump that had been cut by one of the black-clothed men just now. This time, the black-clothed men's cultivation was not low and their combat power was high. It was just that they did not quite understand Lu Chen's strange black flame technique. They suffered a lot in the battle just now. However, Lu Chen felt that if he waited until the next assassination, the power of the black flame would probably be reduced. "Hey, why are you like this?" There was an angry complaint from the front. Needless to say, it was White Lotus. Her beautiful and moving little face was full of anger as she said, "A bunch of people randomly jump out from the side to kill you. You're like a madman. You even implicated me." Even though Lu Chen was exhausted, he still laughed loudly when he heard this and said, "Didn't I tell you just now? Don't regret it if you follow me. But seeing that we've both stayed on the Kunlun Mountains, I'll give you a word of advice. These people are all madmen. They have no qualms about killing people. Otherwise, you'd better leave me. At least you can live a little longer." White Lotus snorted. Her expression was a little strange. After looking at Lu Chen for a while, she suddenly said, "You really are a jinx." Lu Chen said, "Everything is fine. Why are you scolding people?" White Lotus said, "If not, why did you implicate Exin to die?" Lu Chen's body shook. The smile on his face slowly disappeared. He seemed to have something to say, but in the end he remained silent. After a bitter laugh, he shook his head and did not speak again. After being suddenly stabbed by White Lotus's cold words, Lu Chen became much quieter. He did not say a word for a long time. As a result, the atmosphere between the 2 people and the wolf suddenly became stiff. However, Atsu did not seem to care. It was still sniffing around. It seemed that it was not at ease with its surroundings. Lu Chen whistled, and Atsu ran to his side. Lu Chen gestured for it to squat down, and then he climbed onto it. Then he rode on the black wolf and began to move forward. White Lotus's eyes instantly lit up. The way she looked at Atsu suddenly changed. After a while, she ran over and said loudly, "I want to sit too. Let me sit too." Atsu growled. It seemed to be unwilling. Lu Chen also waved his hand and said, "Go, go, go. I was injured. In order to recover as soon as possible, I let Atsu carry me temporarily. How are you injured? Why are you joining in the fun? Go away." White Lotus said indignantly, "Hey, don't turn your back on me so quickly. At least I helped you to stop 2 men in black just now, okay? Besides, if it wasn't for my skills and the magical power of ice and snow that my dead master taught me, wouldn't I be dead now? How could I help you win this battle? It's already like this, and you still won't let me ride this black dog wolf? Lu Chen smiled and said, Atsu has its own intelligence. It has its own decision in its heart. After saying that, he lowered his head and patted Atsu's head. He said, Atsu, are you going to let her come up? As he said that, he pointed at White Lotus. Atsu looked at the direction he was pointing at. It barked twice and then shook its head like a child playing with a rattle drum. White Lotus was very angry, but there was nothing she could do. She could only scold the stupid dog, no black wolf, and then followed the two of them forward. Along the way, Lu Chen would pat Atsu's head from time to time, indicating the direction it should go. Unconsciously or unconsciously, he avoided the strange dark brown forest. At the same time, not far away from him, because Lu Chen was riding the wolf and White Lotus was walking, her body looked even smaller. But White Lotus did not have much opinion on this. She seemed to have calmed down from her initial anger. She said to Lu Chen, I have something to ask you. Lu Chen declined to comment and said, Say it. White Lotus said, Why did you suddenly sense the pursuers so keenly? She stared at him and said, This is not quite right. You always seem to know something about the evil sect in advance. Lu Chen shook his head and said, You misunderstood. The reason why I know a little about the evil sect is actually because I once stayed in the evil sect for a period of time. White Lotus thought for a moment and said, If that's the case, no wonder those evil sect people shouted at you like a traitor. Lu Chen smiled bitterly and did not want to continue this topic. At the same time, he also turned around and stared at the road he came from. His face showed a trace of doubt. Previously, he had purposely chosen this inaccessible path. He had even risked encountering the savage and terrifying barbarian tribes in the Land of Chaos, in order to avoid being hunted down by both the righteous and Devil Dao. But why after so many days, those evil sect killers still seemed to be able to clearly find his whereabouts? This matter made people feel that there was something strange about it. Chapter 254. There's something I must ask you. Lu Chen suddenly stopped and said to White Lotus, If you don't make it clear, we can't stay together. White Lotus glanced at him and said, You look like you're interrogating a criminal, what is it? Although I have fought with you a few times, but until now I have not really let you down. I am just a little girl, you are a man, what are you afraid of? I really don't understand. Saying that, she shook her head repeatedly, looking as if she did not agree. Lu Chen was not moved at all. He did not pay attention to her changing the topic, only stared at her and said, On the night of the full moon, why did you go to that forest? White Lotus snorted and said, I was bored, so I went to play. Why? Can't I? Lu Chen indifferently said, There was such a heavy storm, why did you go to that dark forest to play? White Lotus's mouth twitched, but she turned her head and said, None of your business. Lu Chen did not ask further, turned and walked away, said, It doesn't matter if I don't care, but you don't need to follow. White Lotus looked back and saw Lu Chen and Atsu had really left on their own, neat and tidy, without the slightest bit of sloppiness. She could not help but be angered. Her figure flashed and floated in front of them, stretched out her hand to block Lu Chen's way, angrily said, I just want to follow you. What do you want? How can you be so petty? At least when the evil faction tried to assassinate you, I helped you to hold back a few killers. Why are you so quick to turn your back on me? If you didn't help me in front of the evil faction killers, I wouldn't even ask you these questions. Lu Chen shook his head and said, It's not that I'm petty, it's that the identity of the people who went to that forest that night is not a small matter. I must find out. If you don't tell me, then I can't go with you. If you insist on following me, then I can only fight with you, and then both of us will be injured and go our separate ways. That's it. White Lotus was stunned for a moment. She still didn't quite understand, but she saw that Lu Chen's expression was unusually firm. He didn't seem to be joking, nor did he show any signs of relenting. The expression on her face fluctuated. After a while she said, All right, I'm here to look for you. Lu Chen's gaze suddenly turned cold as he looked at White Lotus and said coldly, "You are from the Three Realms demon sect?" "What? Of course not." White Lotus cried out, looking angry and aggrieved. "No matter what, I'm a five-pillar genius who was accepted by a soul formation perfected lord, alright? I'm not a fool to join a fiend cult for no reason." Lu Chen stared at her for a moment. Then he slowly nodded. His expression softened a little. "What you said makes sense." Then he seemed to have thought of something. He suddenly smiled bitterly and said in a low voice, "But to be honest, there are actually those kinds of fools." "What?" White Lotus didn't hear clearly and asked. "Oh, nothing." Lu Chen waved his hand. Then he sternly asked, "Why did you look for me that night? Also, how did you know that I was in that forest and find me?" Speaking up to here, Lu Chen's expression turned serious. These days, he had been repeatedly recalling the process of that full moon night. Other than perfected Lord Tian Lan going back on his words and not going outside, what surprised and puzzled him the most was the sudden appearance of White Lotus. This little girl seemed to be filled with countless secrets, making it hard for people to see her true face. White Lotus looked a little reluctant. It seemed that she didn't want to say it, but under Lu Chen's determined gaze, she finally shrugged and said, "I can feel your position." Lu Chen's body shook. A trace of astonishment flashed across his face. He said, "My position? Are you sure? Haven't you always been interested in Atu? I had already believed that you were probably able to sense the location of this stupid dog because of the secret of blood feeding, this kind of messy southern barbarian sorcery." Roar. Atu roared from the side and bared his teeth. His expression was ferocious as he looked at White Lotus with an unfriendly gaze. White Lotus was angry. She spat at the guy who looked like a giant wolf and scolded, "It's Lu Chen who scolded you. What are you yelling at me for? Are you bullying the weak and afraid of the strong?" Atsu wagged its tail and leaned against Lu Chen. It seemed to be saying, "Don't try to drive a wedge between us, woman." White Lotus shook her head. She was too lazy to care about the strange black dog. She said to Lu Chen seriously, "Now that things have come to this, it seems that I can only tell you the truth. In fact, what I can feel is not this stupid dog but your position. You have the breath of the branch of the tree of God on you, and it always resonates with my pendant." As she said, she reached into her chest and turned over her clothes. She took out a pendant. It was the branch of the tree of God that Lu Chen had seen that day. Lu Chen's expression changed slightly. After White Lotus said those words, she kept staring at Lu Chen's expression. At the same time, she stared at him, waiting for him to speak. Unexpectedly, Lu Chen just frowned and did not speak for a long time. She could not see anything and felt a little unhappy. He said, "This branch of the tree of God is definitely a rare treasure in this world. It's one of a kind, so I want to know why you have the breath of the branch of the tree of God on you." Lu Chen was speechless. At this time he of course understood. As for why he had the breath of the branch of the tree of God on him, the answer was also obvious. It was naturally the mysterious tree hole that accidentally brought the unconscious White Lotus into the seed. As a result, the ancient tree hole absorbed abundant spiritual power from the branch of the tree of God and changed. The most obvious and most mysterious change was that, on the tree wall that was covered by the green mist in the tree hole, the shape of two doorways appeared. The tree of God was a holy object that was worshipped and revered by the Three Realms divine sect. When Lu Chen first sneaked into the devil sect, he did not really believe in this thing. However, later on he found out that the legendary one branch, two leaves, one seed really existed. Moreover, by chance he also secretly obtained the most important seed, the seed of the tree of God. And the branch of the tree of God came from the same source. If something magical happened between the two of them, it would not be too strange. However, from then on, White Lotus could suddenly feel his own position. This was a very troublesome thing. While he was calculating, White Lotus asked, "I've been thinking about it for a long time. I didn't feel anything like this when I first saw you. It was only after I fainted that you started to have this aura." Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat. He could not help but look at White Lotus. He thought to himself, this little girl looks young, but her mind is really exquisite, crystal clear, and extremely smart. It is as if she has a telepathic connection with me and thought of the same thing at once. White Lotus looked at Lu Chun and snorted coldly. Did you do something when I was unconscious? That's why the power of the branch of the tree of God was a little difficult to control after I woke up. There's no such thing. Lu Chun shook his head very straightforwardly and lied to the girl without blushing. Then he said, could it be that you found something wrong with the branch of the tree of God? White Lotus gritted her teeth and looked a little distressed. That's the problem. The treasure itself didn't seem to have any problems. But why did you suddenly have this kind of breath? Lu Chun relaxed and laughed. Maybe it's because you used the power of the tree of God to attack me that day. After I was injured, I got a little smell. You can't blame me for this. White Lotus looked doubtful and looked at Lu Chun suspiciously. She probably felt that this man's words couldn't be completely trusted. But at the moment she couldn't say anything. After all, there was nothing wrong with the branch of the tree of God. Lu Chun put down the stone in his heart and felt much more relaxed. He turned around and continued to walk forward. At the same time he said to White Lotus, then according to what you said, you were able to find me in this disorienting lands because of the breath of the branch of the tree of God. White Lotus said, yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to catch up to you. You're as cunning as a loach. If I were someone else, I probably wouldn't have been able to catch up to you. Lu Chun chuckled. His face was expressionless, but at the same time, he snorted in his heart. That's right. Logically speaking, he should have shaken off his pursuers. Why were they able to catch up to him? Several of our hall's most powerful experts who specialize in tracking have already entered the disorienting lands. No matter how Hei Lang tries to evade, he shouldn't be able to escape from their pursuit. At the foot of Kunlun Mountain, in Kunwa City, inside the Black Hill Pavilion in a secluded alley, Old Ma expressionlessly leaned against the wall of the hand-wrapping corridor. He looked at the two people in the courtyard. One was a bald fatty with an unusually tall and sturdy figure. Even though he was just sitting, he seemed taller than the charming and beautiful woman standing in front of him. When Old Ma's gaze fell on the woman again, there was a trace of deeply concealed fear in his eyes. She was Shuang, the leader of Zhengxiameng Fuyunji. She had been in this position for 10 years. Once, he and Lu Chun could be considered as people who lived under her protection and lived in seclusion to avoid calamity. At this moment, when she said these words to true Lord Tianlan, her expression was calm. It was as if she was talking about an ordinary matter that had nothing to do with her. There was no joy or anger on true Lord Tianlan's face. There was only calmness. After a while, true Lord Tianlan suddenly shook his head and said, not necessarily. Shui Ying was a little surprised. She raised her head and looked at true Lord Tianlan. She frowned and said, but isn't Hei Lang almost a cripple? True Lord Tianlan closed his eyes and didn't say anything. Shui Ying waited for a while and didn't dwell on this issue. She said, I came here this time to ask you to tell me how we should treat Hei Lang in the future. At this moment Old Ma, who was standing to the side, unconsciously straightened his body. His gaze also quietly fell on true Lord Tianlan's face. There was a moment of silence in the courtyard. Shui Ying slowly asked, word by word, should we release him or kill him? Chapter 255. Should he be let go, or should he be killed? Shui Ying spoke very slowly. Although her expression was still calm, there was a hint of seriousness in her eyes as she stared unblinkingly at true Lord Tianlan. Old Ma, who was in the corridor, seemed to be holding his breath as he looked nervously at the fatty sitting in the courtyard. True Lord Tianlan was silent for a while, then said lightly, don't worry about him, let him be. Shui Ying nodded and agreed. Old Ma, who was beside her, let out a long sigh and wiped his forehead with his hand. True Lord Tianlan's gaze seemed to inadvertently sweep over the corridor, but it quickly moved away. He looked at Shui Ying and said, mobilize the people from the disorienting lands and send them back to the immortal city in several batches. You also go back there to oversee things and prepare carefully. In about half a year to a year, I will send out the heaven token. Shui Ying had been very calm all along. Even when it came to dealing with Hei Lang, She did not show any change in her expression. However, when she suddenly heard the words Heaven Token, her body shook violently. She could not help but ask True Lord Tianlan. My lord, are you talking about the Heaven's Token? True Lord Tianlan nodded, and did not say anything. Shuang lowered her head, as if she knew that she had lost her composure. However, after taking a deep breath, her expression had already calmed down. There was even a hint of excitement in her eyes. True Lord Tianlan saw the change in Shui Ying's expression, but did not say anything. After a while, Shuang asked carefully, My lord, about the reorganization of Fuyunji that you mentioned before. Let's begin. True Lord Tianlan did not hesitate and said straightforwardly, Just do as I told you before. The immortal city has basically been arranged, you just need to follow the plan. I still need to reorganize the Kunlun party for a while, but it should not take too long. When the time comes, I will come and tell you. My lord is wise. Shuang bowed deeply. At this moment, the face of this charming and beautiful woman did not seem to have the usual fierceness. Instead, there was a bit of heartfelt admiration. However, perfected Lord Tianlan was probably the only person in this world who could make a woman like her have such an expression. After a while, when all that needed to be said was said, Shuang bade farewell and left. Supreme Lord Tianlan naturally sat there without moving. It was old Ma who sent Shuang out of the deserted Black Hill Pavilion. Just as she was about to step out of the door, Shuang suddenly stopped and turned to look at old Ma. Shui Ying's expression was different from her previous humble and obedient demeanor in front of True Lord Tianlan in the courtyard. At this moment, Shui Ying's expression had returned to her usual self. The sharpness hidden in her beautiful face seemed to be released once again as she looked indifferently at Old Ma. Old Ma stepped aside and quietly lowered his head. Old Ma, Blood Oriole called out. I'm here, replied Old Ma. How long have you been with Hei Lang? Old Ma hesitated for a moment, but still answered honestly, more than 10 years. If we count from the time when he was still in the devil cult, then even earlier. Shuang hummed and said, You are also an old person in Fuyunji. Moreover, Hei Lang's identity is special. Back then, even I could not ask about him. Only you and Supreme could contact him. What do you think of this person? Old Ma was silent for a moment, then said, It doesn't matter what I think. The most important thing is what Supreme and you plan to do. As long as there is an order, we as subordinates will naturally follow it. Shuang stared at him for a moment, then nodded and left without saying anything else. After watching the charming yet vaguely fierce woman leave, Old Ma stood alone for a while before returning to the backyard. Supreme Tianlan was still sitting in the same place. At this moment he was looking up at the sky. Old Ma walked to his side and stood there. He also looked up and saw a dark cloud floating in the small sky above his head. Do you blame me? Supreme Lord Tianlan suddenly asked. Old Ma shook his head and said, No, it was Hei Lang who couldn't get over it and insisted on walking down the road of no return. It's not your fault. Supreme Tianlan snorted and shook his head without saying anything. Old Ma continued, That night, on the long street of Kunwa City, I already told him everything that should be said. Hei Lang himself should know how serious the consequences of his actions were, and how troublesome it would be. Supreme Tianlan was silent for a long time before he said, After staying in the devil cult for a long time, his temperament has probably changed. Old Ma's body trembled slightly and he subconsciously blurted out, But he's absolutely respectful and loyal to you. Supreme Tianlan turned to look at Old Ma. That gaze was calm and emotionless, but it seemed as heavy as a mountain. At that moment, Old Ma felt as if the entire Kunlun mountain was pressing down on his shoulders and back, making him feel suffocated. He almost knelt down. Fortunately, this feeling disappeared in the blink of an eye. In the end, he clenched his teeth and endured it. But after a while, the back of his clothes was already wet. After a while, Supreme Tianlan seemed to be a little dispirited and said, Forget it. Anyway, it's already like this. Let him be. I don't know if he really came back from the land of chaos alive. Shuang went all the way out of Kunwa City and came to a secluded place outside the city. There were already people from Fuyunji waiting for her, and they welcomed her. Shuang ordered people to stand guard outside while she walked alone to a quiet place. She then took out a bright yellow talisman from her bosom and directly lit it up. This was the highest grade sound talisman, and each one was extremely valuable. But compared to the secret treasure of the Kunlun party, the Wind Whisper disc, it was naturally still a bit inferior. But sound talismans were more convenient and easy to use. Although there were some limitations, such as the fact that two people couldn't communicate with each other and could only transmit a single message, over the years, sound talismans were still quite popular among the higher-ups of Zhengxianmeng. As the fire lit up, several magnificent spirit lights flickered, forming a ring that kept rotating. Shui Ying's expression was solemn as she said to the ring of spirit lights, "Give up on the pursuit and return to the immortal city." As soon as she finished speaking, the magnificent ring of spirit lights suddenly trembled with incomparable intensity. There were faint tiny waves of air in the air that rushed towards the surroundings with incomparable speed, faintly emitting ear-piercing whistling sounds. This continued for a little less than the time it took to drink a cup of tea, before it gradually calmed down. Then, the ring of spirit lights disappeared, and the sound talisman was completely burnt at this moment. Shuang swung her hand, and the last bit of ash fell from her white palm and floated in the wind. At the same time, in the faraway land of chaos, in a river valley that was blooming with a large expanse of bright flowers, a similar sound talisman was also burning in the hand of a woman in red. The strange ring of light flickered with a magnificent luster, flashing on her fingertips, causing her beautiful face to become a little bright red, as if she was a little excited. The woman in red stood in the river valley not too far away from the bloodthirsty demon flowers. If there were people familiar with the strange and cruel habits of these demon flowers, they would probably be able to see that she just happened to be standing on the edge of that invisible boundary. If she just went a little further, the bloodthirsty demon flowers would be alarmed, and they would start hunting for food. Under the clear sky, this scene of a beautiful woman and a beautiful flower was really beautiful, but in the dark, danger lurked everywhere, and life and death were only an inch away. Further away in the river valley, there were quite a few people standing. These people seemed to be wearing different clothes, but each of them was valiant and capable. They were all part of the elites of this hall in Zhengxianmeng and Fuyunji. For so many years, the devil cult had been on the decline, and Zhengxianmeng had been peaceful for a long time. Only Fuyunji, a hall that specialized in dealing with the devil cult, had all kinds of powerful people. At that moment, the red-clothed woman was looking at the ring of spiritual light in her hand the entire time. As for the surrounding people, they had all made way for her. All of them were quite a distance away from her. Evidently, this red-clothed woman's status in the floating clouds department was not low. After a short moment, the spirit light ring suddenly shook violently, and dazzling light flickered. Immediately after, a sentence came out of the light. It was unexpectedly the same sentence that Shuang had said through the sound transmission talisman outside Kunwu City in the Western continent. This voice wasn't loud, and only the woman in red standing next to the spirit light ring could hear it clearly. After hearing this sentence, she nodded slightly, then flicked her finger. The sound transmission talisman floated up and burned, scattering like dust on the ground behind her. She turned around and walked towards the entrance of the river valley. At the same time, she waved her hands, and the people in the surroundings of Fuyunji quickly gathered around her. "Miss Hong, did Hall Master Shuang send an order?" someone asked from the side. The woman in red, who was addressed as Miss Hong, smiled and nodded. "Yes, Sister Shuang sent me a message just now. She has given me instructions on this matter." Speaking up to here, she paused for a moment, then continued. "You all probably know that she has been in the Western continent's Kunlun Mountain for the past few days. So this order is most likely the order of that true monarch Tian Lan above us." The people around her immediately became restless. Even in Zhengxianmeng, the largest power in the cultivation world, a soul formation true monarch was still an unreachable existence. It was enough to make people feel awe and respect. Not to mention that true monarch Tian Lan was actually the legendary figure who founded Fuyunji. For so many years, he had always led Fuyunji to fight against the devil cult. He was a godlike figure in the hearts of almost everyone present, an existence that was a level higher than the other true monarchs in Zhangxianmeng. Seeing the expressions on everyone's faces and eyes, the woman in red smiled with satisfaction and said, "So everyone must do your best to follow this order. Don't be lazy." Everyone burst into laughter. Someone laughed and said, "Who dares to be lazy? Isn't Miss Hong here to watch? What order is it? Just say it." The woman in red nodded and smiled. Then her expression suddenly became solemn. She said, "Receiving the order from Hall Master, we will use all our strength to chase after the devil cult's black wolf. When we find him, we will kill him without mercy." You're tuning in to the Echoes of the Heart YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.